So welcome and join my Patreon link description. What if Harry x Possessive Hermione? Privet Drive was darkened by an average night that had followed an average day. The close-knit houses only had a few lights on as their occupants prepared to go to bed, only to wake up to an identical, average morning many hours later as the sun rose and overcame the moon. Which was then to be a part of a different night for 12 hours. Only pavement and empty streets were lit up by street lights, their lack of the usual bustle of competitive, well-dressed people cast an eerie sight. And so nobody in their homes looked outside, and besides, there were no other neighbors to spy on out there. Yet Dudley Dursley found himself looking out the window, feeling very distant from his parents, who paid no attention to the outside of their home. He could have sworn that he saw Harry disappear from directly across the house just a couple of hours ago. It had been a very odd sight. Dudley was just returning from a friend's house and looked outside the window, happy that he had beat Harry home. This meant, of course, that his cousin was to be punished for returning home later than him. It wasn't like they were doing anything different, Harry had his own gang tailing him. But then something had caught his eye. There was a man walking down the street, if he could even be called a man, it looked more like a rat than anything else. He had dropped his old, battered hat the moment Harry turned around the corner, looking anxious to get home as quickly as possible. His friends out of eyesight but surely not too far behind. The man said a few words to Harry, pointing to his hat, probably asking him to pick it up for him. Harry bent down towards the hat, but what w? As odd was that at the last minute the old man bent down towards it, too. And then they were gone. It was like the hat had somehow moved them elsewhere. To Privet Drive, it was as though the encounter had never happened. Nobody else seemed to notice, or if they had, they'd consider it a hallucination and take some aspirin, making it all a joke to tell their family over the dinner table. It wasn't that Dudley actually cared about what happened to Harry. In fact, the household was better off without him, even if he wasn't home half the time because of constant detentions. Dudley just couldn't explain something like a disappearance into thin air, and it bothered him. He was unable to peel his gaze away from the window. And then, just as he was about to call it a day and relish the fact that his cousin might be gone for good, Harry reappeared. At first, all Harry could see were green jets of light shooting at him, just barely missing him and sparing him his life, and then it was all gone. He grabbed that old battered hat that had brought him there in the first place. There was a sharp tug around his navel, as though force greater than him or even Voldemort was pulling him through the air. He didn't dare to let go of that hat, no matter how nauseous and exhausted he felt, and just as quickly as it had happened, Harry had returned back to earth, falling to the ground and slowly recovering. Not even feeling the pain because what he had endured from where he'd just escaped was far worse. The sight before him was too good to be true, and he carefully scanned his surroundings to make sure that this wasn't a trick. There were street lamps and houses, and no signs of a graveyard. It was a twin of Privet Drive. Was it Privet Drive? Was he really here? If he was, he'd never been so happy to be here in his life. He'd never known about magic hours before, but there he was, a fugitive from a god-awful graveyard where the most evil creature he'd ever encountered, he'd called himself Lord Voldemort, had displayed all sorts of dark magic on Harry. He hadn't known that wands existed, or that they could conjure such horrible magic, or that they could lift things, tie things up, inflict pain. He hadn't known about Lord Voldemort, or Death Eaters, or anything beyond his own little world living amongst what they called Muggles. He hadn't known that a completely different world lingered behind him, that they knew his name, that people like Voldemort wanted him dead. But it all existed. It had been around the entire time. While he was stuck at Privet Drive, all of this magic existed. After seeing so much magic happen before his eyes and being forced to endure pain when Voldemort said, Crucio, multiple times, Harry did not doubt its existence. He wished it didn't exist, but it did. It was all there. It was real. He dropped the old battered hat, afraid that it would make him return to the place he now feared the most. How that bloody thing had transported him to that bloody graveyard was completely beyond him. It was magic, something that Voldemort was very keen on displaying to Harry. Dark, dark magic. The hat fell to the ground slowly when he let go of it. As though it was regretting being further and further away from him, eager to transport him back to hell. He closed his eyes and put his hands to his forehead, which felt as though it were on fire. Did it split open yet from the pain? Harry had encountered his scar hurting in the past without any sort of explanation. Until now. Harry. Who was that? There was another voice speaking to him. It sounded familiar. Somehow. There was a form walking towards him angrily, the gait of Uncle Vernon. Harry. There it went again. His uncle was repeating himself. Or maybe he was imagining it. He kind of wished he was imagining it. He wished he imagined everything, that it had never happened in the first place. He wished he imagined magic. Harry stood there stupidly, not sure of what to do or say anymore. As the form was prowling towards him, he didn't feel threatened, for once. Nothing Uncle Vernon could do would affect him after Harry had been trapped in a graveyard with Voldemort. Then, with incredible speed, his uncle picked up his pace and grabbed Harry's arm. He didn't like being touched. He kicked. He screamed. He resisted as much as he could. To get his uncle away from him. Didn't he understand? Then again, he didn't know what happened in the graveyard. He couldn't possibly know what he had just survived. No matter how much he was resisting, he was still being pulled somewhere. There were other voices now, too. Aunt Petunia and Dudley, to complete the trio of the people he hated the most, next to Voldemort. Uncle Vernon kept pulling him across the street, muttering curse words paired with things like, "Shut up," and "Stop it," the very favorite parts of his vocabulary aimed at Harry. He whipped the door open and there was suddenly light everywhere. Harry's eyes slowly adjusted gratefully to the light. No more darkness. No more graveyard. Yes, this was home. He was back. He was a survivor from Voldemort's wrath. Flashes of memories whirled inside his mind, but he remained standing, although just barely. Moments ago, facing the most evil wizard, there were wizards, magic was real. He thought that he would never live to see number 4, Privet Drive again. He thought he wouldn't take in another breath, but he escaped. He made it. Harry survived the unspeakable scene at the graveyard and lived to tell the tale, although he wasn't sure he wanted to tell it to anyone anytime soon. Any spectator of what had happened would probably faint, or puke, or die of shock. They were all the foyer, incredibly clean and neat as he had left it, as though nothing had ever happened. Harry wished he could imitate that attitude. But there was a stranger standing there, whom the Dursleys were keeping a distance from. He was the strangest-looking person Harry had seen. Wearing odd robes and an outlandish hat, but nothing could genuinely surprise him now after the graveyard. He could take anything after that hell. "Hello, Harry," he said, in a deep, calm voice. "I'm Albus Dumbledore, and I'm here to help you." Here she was again. Maybe it was because in her first year, Draco Malfoy found out she was Muggle-born, so she hid in the girls' bathroom, the one place he couldn't get to her. Maybe it was because so many people pointed out her buck teeth, so she ran into the nearest classroom so they wouldn't see the tears their shouts had conjured. Maybe it was because last year, Cho Chang chased her, with her giggling group of friends, of course, out of the Great Hall with insults, so she found the nearest broom closet and stayed there for 3 hours. Maybe it was because she waited until past midnight to go to sleep, so she wouldn't have to face the other girls in the dormitories. But no matter what it was, Hermione found herself here. Hiding. Academics aside, hiding was the one thing Hermione was very good at. Unfortunately, there were no empty classrooms or broom closets to hide in at her house, so she had to settle with remaining as silent as possible in her room. Hoping that her parents wouldn't come upstairs to remind her what day it was. Then again, the calendar on her wall seemed to be doing that job all on its own. Every time she glared at it, it glared back, saying, "Hogwarts in just 3 days. Welcome to hell." Hermione had hoped she'd never hide from her parents, who were the 2 of the 3 people whom she actually felt comfortable with. They were respectable, wealthy, and overall great people, but when the last week of August rolled around, their spur-of-the-moment pep talks mutated into long speeches of building self-confidence. Their concern for her social situation at school went overboard, and while a part of her appreciated it, she did not want to remind them of her presence in their house as they returned from a long day at the dentist's office. She looked at her analog clock, perfect and pristine, like the rest of her house, and saw, with a mini heart attack, that it was 6:15, right when her parents usually got home. And as if on cue, she heard the door open and the familiar voices of her parents destroying the one thing she appreciated now more than ever, a silent house. Hermione was finally able to breathe again when there was a lack of Hermione. Come downstairs. She laid down and buried her face in her pillow, wishing she could use a time turner to return to the beginning of the summer. Or even skip the school year and go straight to the following the summer. She stared aimlessly at the calendar that was beckoning her to cry at how close the first day of school was. Until her parents unfortunately recognized her absence. Hermione, you're missing dinner. Jane Granger shouted from the story below. We've got pasta, your favorite. Hermione slowly got up, hoping the slower she moved, the slower time would pass. Okay, I'm on my way, she shouted back to her waiting parents. She washed her face to hide the tear marks streaking her cheeks before joining her parents and escaping from hiding. Albus Dumbledore had seen many faces, but perhaps this was the most tragic he'd ever seen. Harry's eyes didn't look even close to Lily Potter's, sure, they were green. But they didn't possess the bright green sparkle that Albus had remembered from many, many years ago. They were stretched to huge circles and had just seen things that nobody should ever see. He was muttering things about Voldemort. And Albus's worst fears were confirmed. Voldemort had made a second attempt to kill Harry, but had miraculously failed. He wanted to know exactly what happened, he knew even better that it was not the time or place to question Harry, who was continuing to mutter things, perhaps to himself or to Albus. Nobody was really sure. He thought he would meet Harry perhaps, at the earliest, on his 18th birthday. That was when he was to be a legal adult in the Muggle world, and when Albus had all of the rights to knock on the door of number 4, Privet Drive. And introduce Harry to the wizarding world. It would be easy to convince him to go anywhere away from the place he'd been trapped during all of his rememberable life. He had never imagined that this would be the way he'd meet the boy who lived, and how that nickname suited him so well now, after he'd escaped Voldemort's clutches for the second time in his life. Albus had had surveillance on number 4, Privet Drive. He had his own sources that were best not to be revealed to the Ministry of Magic. When it was reported that Harry was not in the house or anywhere even near it, Albus notified Minerva, and both of them led a search. He was nowhere to be found, until now, of course. His sources around the house, namely Arabella Figg, reported the very moment Harry returned. He'd apparently appeared from thin air, holding a battered hat that must have been a portkey. This had struck the sources as very odd, since the boy knew nothing about magic, and nobody was allowed to inform him of mag. I see, it was against the wizarding law and severe consequences were served to whomever rebelled, especially in the infamous case of Harry Potter. Albus apparated immediately to number 4, not caring just how illegal it was critical that he got to Harry before the ministry. And there Harry was, being led into the house by the Dursleys, who had been desperately trying to usher him inside soundlessly, which did not succeed. Petunia shrieked when she'd spotted Albus, and Vernon made odd, incoherent noises of frustration and bewilderment at his appearance. At first, of course, the Dursleys wanted him away. But Albus raised his wand to them, which quieted the family immediately. Until now. The neighbors will overhear him. Petunia Dursley said worriedly, looking across the foyer as she could see through the walls to witness nosy neighbors. That should be the least of our problems, Albus said. Meanwhile, Dudley Dursley was sitting in the middle of the hallway past the foyer, staring at the floor as though wishing it would suck him in. Albus found himself about to ask him what he had seen, but then Harry began shouting and his attention was repossessed. What are you doing here? Harry screamed, pointing at Albus. His round, bloodshot eyes were boring into Albus's calm, light blue ones. There was a ring of sweat around the collar of Harry's oversized t-shirt and he was breathing heavy. As though he had just ran 5 miles. There were all sorts of cuts and bruises that could have quickly been healed by magic, although Albus did not want to see Harry's reaction to magic just yet. There was a possibility that after seeing magic performed for the first time by Lord Voldemort, that he would be very sensitive around magic, even the harmless kind. Harry seemed to not be aware of much around him. It was as though this was the first time he'd ever seen this house. Albus could only imagine what the boy, or young man, rather, was remembering as. His eyes scanned the room. Maybe Harry was seeing along. black cloak instead of the thin coats on the coat hanger. Maybe he was seeing a mysterious dark figure rather than the front door. Maybe he was mistaking a letter in the letterbox for a wand. "I'm here to help you, Harry," he said with a smile, which was difficult, because just looking at Harry's expression would make anyone not want to smile again. Petunia looked around the foyer again nervously, and said, "The neighbors." "Petunia, please," Albus insisted. Harry was standing against the wall of the foyer and was looking around just as nervously as Petunia. Although for completely different reasons, he wasn't worried about being noticed by nosy neighbors, he was worried about someone far, far worse. "I can take you someplace safe, Harry. Away from Voldemort. How does that sound?" he asked. Harry now stared at Albus, looking more confused than scared. He had stopped shouting about Voldemort for a moment, much to Petunia's relief. "How do you know him?" Harry asked, now walking towards him and still breathing heavily. "How do you know Voldemort?" "That's a very complicated question," Albus said kindly. "Let's just say I'm not a big fan of him, either." "I know how confused you must be, Harry. I can explain a lot to you, if you'd like. Like I said before, I know some place safe where you can stay. If your aunt and uncle allow it, of course." This man knew Voldemort. Maybe he could help. Or maybe he couldn't, maybe it was all a trap. Just one big trap for Harry to fall into again. He was done trusting people after picking up that old, battered hat. His guard was up, standing tall against every piece of distrust he could possibly run into. "No intruders allowed." Uncle Vernon was shouting at this man. Albus Dumbledore, saying that he had no right to take Harry away, but Harry was barely paying attention because he had just remembered hearing this man Dumbledore's name before. "It was very surprising for me to hear that you weren't aware of the wizarding world at all," Voldemort said with a cold smile. "I have to admit, I had expected differently. If you were introduced to magic in Hogwarts, maybe you'd be under Dumbledore's command against me. Lucky for me, though, you haven't gotten a scrap of information on magic." Harry shook the memory away, making his mind escape the graveyard. Even just remembering one little piece of what had happened was too much, but if Dumbledore would have had someone under his command against Voldemort, then wasn't he good? Bad people didn't go against Voldemort. Bad people joined Voldemort. Bad was an understatement. More like evil. Harry had thought the Dursleys were evil, but they were saints compared to the acts of torture performed by Voldemort and his followers. Death Eaters. Harry couldn't help but remembering those cloaked people, the Death Eaters, with masks hiding their identities. And with that came more memories. He'd not only seen horrible things, but heard things, too. Things that Voldemort had said and the Death Eaters nodded at. Things that he wished weren't true. His parents didn't die in a car crash. Harry quickly turned his attention to the room around him, sacrificing having to hear the screams of the argument instead of remembering the graveyard. There were shouts from the Dursleys and deep phrases of reason from Dumbledore. The one person who might help him. But his guard was still up, fiercely protecting the trembling Harry behind it. "We stay here for now," Harry said breathlessly. And since he wasn't going to be the first to explain a thing, he demanded, "Tell me everything. So, sweetie, do you have everything packed for school?" Jane asked after an awkward 10-minute silence at the dinner table. And that was why Hermione had been hiding. Sort of. She had most of it packed. There were still some things that needed to be put away in her school trunk, but Hermione couldn't bring herself to pack it all yet. That would make her return to school all too real. And she wasn't ready for that, even if it was 3 days away. "Do you need help?" her mother offered. "I mean, our new neighbors invited me over, but I could cancel the plans, if you'd like." Hermione almost said, "No, thanks, I can handle it myself," but that would have been a complete lie. Maybe, just this one time, she'd come out of hiding and allow hers elf to be with her mother for one last time before term began. "Sure. Thanks," she replied with a smile before taking another forkful of her meal. "Have you talked to that Neville boy?" Carl interjected. Ed after a few minutes of a silence that was somehow less awkward, now that Jane had broken the ice. Hermione didn't need to look at her father to know he was glaring at her, as though Neville would somehow sense this from miles away. "Not since last week, Dad," she said impatiently. "I don't see why you hate him so much." Actually, she did see why he'd hate Neville. It was in his nature as the FA. Fair of a teenage girl to hate any boy she communicated with. But really, Carl didn't have much to worry about. Hermione had never had a boyfriend, or anything nearly close to it, and she felt as though that was the way things were going to be for a very long time. And Hermione had never felt anything romantic towards Neville. He was just her friend, her only friend, and vice versa. The two shared many things in common, in popularity. A desire for success, even though Hermione was admittedly better in this department and generally disliked by other classmates. From their first year at Hogwarts, they were stuck with each other. With nobody else to turn to. Just looking out for my Hermione, Carl said. And I don't hate him. Hermione said distractedly, curling her lips. Jane laughed. And that was why Hermione wanted to stay at home. Is he a prefect, too? Jane asked a few moments later. It would be nice to get along with the other prefect of your house. Hermione didn't like talking about school. She wished her mother would bring up something, anything, else besides school. No, he's not, Hermione said with a frown. I'm not sure who the boy is, but I'm sure I won't get along with him. Carl gave her an appreciative nod. Oh, don't say that, Jane said. That was generally her attitude. Look on the bright side of things, see the glass half full, don't be such a downer. Who knows what could happen? She asked with a wink. And, could you pass the salt, please, honey? Carl interrupted after clearing his throat. Jane, getting the message after passing the salt and seeing her husband's expression, let the topic go but began to ask Hermione about the prefect duties she had. Can we not talk about school anymore? Hermione asked 20 minutes later, when she and her mother were sitting in Hermione's room, packing up the rest of her school stuff. Hermione had been right, there was no way she would have been able to put all of this away by herself. It wasn't physically straining at all. But the emotional strain of it would have been overwhelming. Taking all of her school possessions and removing them from the floor of her room, where they were safe. To her trunk was only too relatable to her own removal from her home, that was to happen in just 3 days. 3 days. I'm sorry, sweetie, Jane said, looking up from folding a set of school robes. I know that it's bad enough for you that school is beginning in just a few days. Hermione could only nod as she put away a small pile of books. She was afraid that if she spoke again, she'd begin to cry. And she never cried in front of her mom. Usually her crying moments were spent late at night, long after her parents had fallen asleep. Her habits of not sleeping until past midnight had transferred over to home and they were virtually unbreakable, so she was stuck with insomnia on top of everything else. But, you know, her mother continued with a small smile, I have a feeling that this year will be much different. Hermione sighed. Of course Jane would still continue to talk about school. She didn't understand just what her daughter endured during the school year. If she did, she wouldn't even begin to talk about it. Like I've said before, you lost so much weight. Boys will be all over you. Jane squealed. Hermione knew that her mother meant well when she put her on a strict diet and brought her along to her visits at the local gym. Jane had assumed that her daughter would have more self-confidence if she lost all of her baby fat and had a more toned form, but even an opulent figure didn't make Hermione content with herself. Even if she was happy with herself from it, her classmates would find a way to ruin the way she saw her own reflection. Again, I doubt it, Hermione managed to choke out, blinking quickly and looking upwards. Oh, sweetie, don't be such a downer, Jane said. This year is going to be different. I promise. So Harry knew everything, well, not everything. But enough to understand just how fucked up this situation was. Surprisingly, most of what Voldemort said was true, no matter how biased his hatred was. Harry's parents were murdered by the very man he'd just encountered. He had always thought they died in a car crash. That was the story he'd been told by the Dursleys, but then what reason did he ever have to trust them? And the Dursleys had known about magic. Each of them yelped nervously when the word, magic, was brought up. A part of Harry couldn't blame them for being nervous around it, he could not imagine seeing magic ever. Again, Dumbledore said there was good magic. Good magic. Harry couldn't imagine. Good magic. Magic he'd seen was horrible, dark, scarring, even just thinking about magic made him remember green jets of light shooting at him. The pain his body had endured, the things he'd been forced to see. You can go to Hogwarts as a student. You'll be very safe there, the man named Dumbledore was now saying. The word, safe, had a new meaning to him now, far away from Voldemort. You will meet many people your age there, he continued. I'm sure you'll make plenty of friends. But aren't I famous? Harry asked numbly. Famous. It was odd to hear the empty word. He certainly didn't feel famous. Yes, I'd say you're very popular amongst our kind. Then nobody would really want to be my friend, he said slowly. They'd just want me because of my fame. Well, Dumbledore began, but a new thought struck Harry that could not be contained. If I am famous, why didn't anyone rescue me from this shithole? Harry asked. Please don't curse in front of me, Harry, Dumbledore said, but Harry ignored him. How come I don't even have a pound to my name? If I'm so famous, people would want to see me, wouldn't they? Your kind don't really care. If you did, I'd be living with you people a long time ago. I understand your frustration, Harry. I do. There are certain laws. You people have a government. Vernon Dursley interrupted, startled. Yes, Dumbledore said calmly, then he continued as though Vernon had never spoken in the first place. There are certain laws that prevent anyone from foreseeing those under the age of 18, the Muggle coming of age, to attend school without a guardian's permission. Vernon shouted at once, don't go blaming this all on me, you. We did want to communicate with you, Harry. Each year before school, we sent a Hogwarts letter. That was our one annual hope, the one chance we had. The Ministry has their own eyes set on this house, making sure nobody gets in contact with you until we have permission from your legal guardians. That's bullshit, Harry said bluntly. I understand why you're mad, but please don't curse in front of me, Dumbledore said for a second time. Closing his eyes briefly. If there was not so much at stake with taking you away from here, then we would have been there in a heartbeat. Of course, I am breaking the law now. And I'm not sure if the Ministry will be forgiving even if this is an emergency. He then turned to face Vernon. I would greatly appreciate it if you signed this, he said, extracting a piece of paper from his pocket. He had brought the letter along with him to number 4, Privet Drive, in the hopes of getting legal permission from the Dursleys once and for all. Harry will only have to return during the summers. Other than that, he will be out of your hair. And he would not be allowed to perform magic while away from school. Perform magic. Had Harry heard correctly? He was seriously being expected to perform magic. After what had happened, there was no such thing as good magic. A part of him wished that Voldemort had finished him off, then he wouldn't have to keep seeing hallucinations full of dark memories every time he turned around. Oh, fine, since he knows about you lot already, Vernon said haughtily, taking the letter and extracting a pen from his pocket. He sig. Ned quickly then looked at the foyer walls just as Petunia had, as though he thought the neighbors would see him sign a document as odd as this one. And just like that, Harry was being led outside without real awareness of his own actions. Dumbledore's old, wrinkled hand had surprising strength as it held onto Harry's right arm. Where are we going? Harry demanded, trying to shake himself from Dumbledore's grip. The darkness around him was too familiar to the pitch-black night that surrounded his screams of pain in the graveyard. What if Voldemort was here, waiting in the shadows for the perfect moment to ambush them? Or maybe he had sent Death Eaters to keep an eye on Harry and watch for the perfect opportunity to attack once again. After all, they knew where he lived. Wormtail had approached him right in front of number 4. Privet Drive. And that was where Harry had grabbed the portkey. Or at least, portkey was the word Dumbledore had described it as. It was a common household object that could transport you anywhere, and Harry's portkey had transported him to hell. Thinking of the portkey reminded him of his escape. For some reason, after hearing about magic, anything seemed possible. He had remembered that the old, battered hat had somehow brought him there, so couldn't it bring him back? Within a moment, he found himself untying the knots discreetly. Harry had his own bag of tricks. He knew how to hot-wire cars, pick locks, and untie very complicated knots. They had underestimated him. Within a minute, he was free, and the Death Eaters screamed odd words that sounded either Latin or Greek or both. Spells, dark, horrible spells. There were many green jets of light trailing him, and Harry didn't want to know what they did. And then he had seen the hat. He lunged It just as he felt another jet of light miss him by an inch. And he was back. Somewhere safe, Dumbledore said, barely opening his lips to utter the words. Hogwarts. Already? Harry asked with raised eyebrows. No, not yet, the older man said, again being nearly inaudible and looking as though he hadn't spoken at all. Was he muttering so discreetly because Voldemort might have been around? When he spoke, he confirmed Harry's worst fears. Look, Harry, it's too dangerous to talk here. You'll just have to trust me. Harry, whose guard was still up, was not prepared to really trust anyone, so he didn't say anything. Dumbledore took out his wand, or at least, what it seemed like, and Harry stayed as far away as he possibly could while under the man's strong grip. A pen and piece of parchment appeared out of nowhere. Out of nowhere. Thin air. Like how Harry had appeared, from Privet Drive to the graveyard, and back again. What else was this man going to conjure? Were they really just a harmless pen and piece of parchment? There was no way Harry could associate with Dumbledore if he was going to use magic. There was no such thing as good magic. I'm sorry, Harry, Dumbledore said the moment Harry jumped. I should have warned you. I am merely writing down where we are going. Writing down? Harry asked distractedly, barely aware of anything anymore. He was still staring at the pen and paper, expecting it to mutate into a Death Eater or Voldemort, or perform some kind of dark spell of its own. For obvious reasons, Dumbledore said, barely inaudible, although now that Harry thought of it, it was pretty obvious, he did not want to be overheard. Seeing the older man even nervous about saying anything too secret outside made Harry even more scared. Nobody was safe here, or anywhere, really, at least. That applied to Harry. He actually could not imagine ever feeling safe again. Dumbledore began to write with that bloody pen onto that bloody piece of parchment. Harry shut his eyes, expecting some sort of spell to happen, or a Death Eater to appear from thin air, but nothing happened. He was still very nervous, though, when Dumbledore moved the parchment so that Harry could see it. Harry didn't even move to hold the paper. He still didn't feel secure. Yet he found himself tilting his head to read the slanted handwriting. The Order of the Phoenix headquarters is located at number 12, Grimmauld Place. But within a second, the paper crumbled unto itself and eventually turned into untraceable dust. Harry jumped back. What was going to happen next? Would it burst into flame? He looked around. Where were the Death Eaters? Voldemort. Were they still lurking in the shadows? That was supposed to happen, Harry, Dumbledore reassured him. Now, hopefully you've memorized that. Because I need to take you there now, before someone spots us. Before someone spots us. That made Harry even more uneasy. At this point, he didn't really care where they were going, as long as it was away from here, where all of the shadows seemed darker and scarier than they'd ever been. I need you to promise that you won't try to break away from me, he said in the eerie silence. Why? Harry demanded. Promise me. Well, Harry had nothing to lose. Sure, why the hell not, was his form of a promise. Please don't curse in front of me, Dumbledore said. Okay, you will feel a little bit of discomfort and some dizziness. I wish we could get to where we need to go another way, but I'm afraid this is our last resort. Now on the count of 3. On the counter of 3 what? What the hell was going to happen? 1. Harry shut his eyes again, feeling stupid, but how he looked was the last of his worries at the moment. 2. Oh God, what was going to happen? Harry was shaking. If they were going to this number 12, Grimmauld Place, then couldn't they just drive there? What kind of magic was going to happen now? Didn't Dumbledore understand just how dangerous it was? 3. Harry barely had time to think about anything else as Privet Drive and he was squeezed through the air, as though it could not possibly contain his mass. Every particle of him was being pressed on from every possible angle. There was no such thing as good magic. Ellipsis. What was going on? Where was he being pulled? Or pushed, rather, he would have thought of this as painful before the graveyard. But now that he had endured so much pain within the few hours he was stuck in Voldemort's wrath, this was absolutely nothing. Although it was dizzying, the world was nowhere, somehow, as he was pushed through the air in some odd universe, and his heart was racing and was also being squeezed to its limit. Somehow he knew that all of this happened within a split second, yet in his mind, it had seemed like an eternity of twisting and squeezing through thin air. It was different from a portkey. he thought to himself as his feet gratefully landed solid ground. What the fuck just happened? He opened his eyes and saw that wherever they were, it was still night, and light from the street lamps from was fading by the slowly passing seconds, as though someone was turning them off, one by one. And Harry saw that the lights were, in fact, being turned off by Dumbledore. He was holding a small little shiny object that literally took the orbs of light and absorbed them. It was too much. Within a few seconds, Harry found himself grasping for a nearby railing, leaning over, and puking his guts onto the pavement beneath him. The burning sensation in his throat somehow burned all of his other worries, even for just a moment. As he lurched forward again and let everything go, he felt too sick, so sick of the world. Sick of every freaking thing. He hasn't realized that he had so much in his stomach, but maybe it was better this way, to empty out all his guts and start all over again, because this life was too sick for him. Sick. He felt a hand on his shoulder and jumped, but when he turned, he saw that it was just Dumbledore. It was odd to have someone's hand on his shoulder like that. It was almost comforting, something Harry hadn't genuinely felt before. "Let's go inside," Dumbledore said softly before turning around and facing the apartment building in front of them. There was number 11 and number 13, but no number 12. What the fuck? But before Harry could ask, he was leaning forward again and relieving even more of his lunch back onto the pavement. His throat flared up again, and after a few moments, he was able to stand up straight again, composing himself. Dumbledore didn't offer a gesture of comfort, although Harry didn't have his hopes up in the first place. When he turned back towards the apartment building, there was a number 12 between 11 and 13. As though it had appeared out of nowhere. Harry didn't even bother to ask this time. Everything was just so fucked up. Harry stumbled up the stairs and Dumbledore, just to his left, knocked on the door. Within moments, the door opened and a pale arm reached out and gestured them inside. Harry took one last sweeping glance behind him, wondering if this was the last time he'd see the outside world. Then wondering if he even cared anymore, then stepped inside. Dumbledore immediately followed suit, and the door was closed. The darkness of the long hallway before him made him almost forget what the outside world even looked like already. There was dust everywhere, and his stomach threatened, yet again, to reject whatever could have possibly been left there. There were shadows here, too. When would he ever escape from them? Oh my, Dumbledore, is this him? A female voice said from the darkness, making Harry jump. He could just barely make out the outline of a short, plump figure. He looks awful. Then again, given what's just happened, oh, the poor dear. Yes, this is him. When did you get here, Molly? Dumbledore asked. I thought that you and Arthur were bringing your family here tomorrow morning. Well, I wanted to be here to help with the first sweep of the home. Arthur's still at work, and it would look odd if every member of the order suddenly had to leave the ministry. The rest of them are showing up tomorrow morning, the woman named Molly said quickly. So far, Sirius has done an okay job with cleaning up the rest of the house, but a lot still needs to be done. I guess he never really expected guests, and most of the house is somewhat safe. Somewhat safe, Harry whispered. It was too dangerous, he felt, to actually speak in a regular voice. While surrounded in darkness, he never knew what might be lurking in the shadows. Well, we've gotten rid of all the dangerous jinxes and curses. Just watch your step, that's all, the woman's voice told him. As though dangerous jinxes and curses in a house were the most natural thing in the world. We've just settled in, so it'll take some time to clean things up. Somehow that wasn't comforting. And you must be starving. The voice continued. This woman seemed very motherly, almost too motherly. He wasn't used to this. Harry felt a pat on his arm, and then he was being dragged again, but not by Dumbledore this time. He was pulled into this dark hallway by a stranger, and it reminded him of the graveyard again. The graveyard, where he'd been tortured in a similar darkness, listening to Voldemort's and the Death Eater's laughter at his misery, wishing that it would all end right there, somehow managing to escape from his wrath. There's plenty of food, I've cooked enough for everyone who's helping clean up the place, of course. You don't have to help out with anything at all, dear, and really, cleaning up everything is the least of our worries now. The woman's voice thankfully pulled him out of his thoughts. Eventually they met the end of the dark hallway, where there was a brightly lit room, thank freaking God. His eyes burned, so he was temporarily blind from the bright lights, but at least it was away from any sort of darkness, even for a little while. "Oh my!" the woman named Molly exclaimed. Harry blinked quickly as his vision became his once again in a haste to see what was going wrong. His heart was pounding with anticipation, and then slowly the outline of a figure was visible. It was Molly, but she wasn't looking at anything else in the room, she was staring at him. Oh my," she repeated, clasping her hands over her face. "You look terrible, oh, just terrible. Here, how about you sit down and, oh my, I'll give you a year's worth of food. You don't have to worry about anything. Oh my, you look so awful." Harry couldn't imagine just how terrible he looked. If he looked anything like how he felt, then he could easily empathize with Molly. He looked away and scanned the rest of the room. Because seeing her reaction to him made everything all too real. It looked as though this room had been dug up from decades ago, and it was barely habitable, but at least it was well lit. And as his vision was coming back, he figured he'd stay anywhere as long as it was lit. He couldn't have handled one more minute in that dark, mysterious hallway. There was an ancient dresser to his left that was shaking, as though a monster was lurking in it and trying to escape. Harry took a few unconscious steps from it, unable to help himself from wondering Voldemort was hiding here now. "Oh, they're just spiders, dear," Molly said, finally composing herself from gaping at him. She sent him a weak smile. "Or at least, that's what we think they are. I'll have Sirius double check, just to make sure. Oh, dear, you don't even know Sirius, oh, dear." She seemed to be talking to herself more than anyone else as she walked across the length of the room, where piles of food were already waiting. Harry had never seen so much food, much less eaten so much. His stomach growled, although it wasn't sure if it was even safe to eat after throwing up shortly before. Sit," she insisted when she saw him still standing, looking open-mouthed at the food. Harry snapped out of his trance and walked over to where a long table stood. It looked too old and dusty, as though it would collapse against the lightest of strains. The chairs looked similar, and so it was no wonder that he gently pressed his hand against the seat first and tapped the legs. When he assumed it as somewhat safe, and nothing too terrible was going to result from him taking this seat, he finally sat down gently in a chair that was facing the closed door. He wanted to see every visitor and potential danger entering the room. He closed his eyes shut, but he was still alive. How long was he going to live with this paranoia of everything around him? He remembered that just hours before he knew about magic or anything of the sort, he didn't have much of a care in the world. Harry would have sat in chairs at random without second-guessing a thing, and shadows wouldn't be scary whatsoever, but now he had memories to be scared of. That Molly woman was still muttering to herself, occasionally saying Harry's and Sirius's, that random man whom she'd mentioned before, who would check for spiders, name in the same sentence under her breath. "What's wrong?" Harry asked. After all, anyone giving him this much food and showing enough concern couldn't have been that bad. Molly turned to face him. Her face looking very worn compared to her smiling complexion just minutes before, as though she'd seen just what Harry had seen in the graveyard. "Nothing, dear," she said kindly. "Then who's Sirius?" Molly dropped a plate of food and cursed aloud. She pointed her wand at the plate and it levitated, cleaned itself off, and the food that had remained on the ground vanished. Harry jumped, afraid that he was going to break the chair but more afraid of what other magic this woman was going to perform. After a few still seconds where he stared at the ground, expecting something else to happen, his racing heart began to calm down and he composed himself. "Dumbledore didn't tell you," she said, apparently not noticing his reaction to her performing magic. "It wasn't a question. Harry, sweetie, how about I feed you your first course first, and then we can talk? I need to have a quick word with Dumbledore, if you don't mind." Molly waved her wand again. Harry's heart began to rack. Once again, and a different plate of food levitated across the room, hovering towards Harry as gently as a long black cloak. Harry clutched onto his chair tightly as the plate finally landed on the table in front of him. He found he wasn't hungry anymore. What if the magic had messed it up somehow? What if it was cursed? How long was he going to be afraid of everything? "I'm sorry," she said breathlessly, walking towards him. "I should have known you'd react to magic like that. Oh, you poor thing. I'll be right outside in the hallway. call if you need anything." Then she leaned over the table and gently patted his hair, making it impossibly messier, and walked out of the room, closing the door behind her. Harry was alone. He couldn't help but hear odd noises from every crevice of the room. He wasn't sure if he was imagining that, or if there were more spiders hiding. Molly had said there were spiders, but what if spiders were different here? What if they were bigger and more dangerous in this world? Why would they leave Harry alone with creatures if he couldn't defend himself? He looked around the room for some sort of weapon, just in case, and spotted it. Of course, there would be a knife in a room like this. He tentatively got up from the table. He'd lost his appetite, anyways, and walked across the room, carefully taking each step as though it was going to be his last. He made it. He grabbed the knife that Molly had used for cooking and turned, trying to retrace his steps that he knew were safe. The whole journey, he realized as he slowly sat back down, must have taken at least 5 minutes. Is this how things were going to be? Living in fear, even afraid to walk across a dining room. Well, at least he had the knife in his reflexes. Dumbledore had told him Harry's father had very good reflexes, and played a game called Quidditch. James. His name was James. And his mother was very good at charms and potions, and she grew up with muggles, too. Her name was Lily. Harry had never known his parents' names. He was always too afraid to ask. Don't ask questions was the first rule of living under the Dursleys' roof. James and Lily had died for him. That was what he had learned from Voldemort. Unfortunately. And Harry was the spitting image of James, apparently. Except for his eyes. Those were from his mother. All this time, he never knew. He was so and thought about his parents that he had to blink quickly and look up in order to not look like a pansy, or something ridiculous like that. And just as he faced the chandelier hovering over the room, soaking in light, the door opened. Harry barely had time to grab the knife on the table before he saw someone walking in, but then he relaxed when he noticed it was just Mrs. Weasley. Although he couldn't bring himself to completely let go of his weapon, as though it had become glued to him. "Oh, I just knew I shouldn't have left you alone," Mrs. Weasley scolded. She walked over with a brisk gait, then leaned over the table. Extended her arm. The glare in her eyes was just daring him to test her, so Harry found himself handing over the kitchen knife. Her glare disappeared and she smiled. As Molly turned away and walked back towards the plates of food, his line of vision towards the doorway was restored, and he saw that there was someone lurking there, half covered in a large shadow. Couldn't Molly see this intruder? Wasn't she going to do something about it? Harry quickly stood up from his seat, nearly breaking the delicate seat in the process, and Molly turned around, asking, "What's wrong?" One glance towards the man in the doorway told Molly just what was wrong. "Oh, come in," Molly said casually, waving the man inside. Her casual voice didn't match her expression. She looked worried. Glancing from Harry to the man and back again. The man walked in, and Harry could instantly relate to him. He looked like he'd seen and heard things he'd rather not, as well. Had he encountered Voldemort, too? Was that why he looked so gaunt and distressed? The light looked odd on him, as though he'd been surrounded by darkness for too long, as though that suited him better. "Hi, Harry," the man from the doorway said with a smile that stretched the pale skin of his face. "I'm Sirius Black." Before Harry could think or move, Dumbledore walked in and patted Sirius on the back. "Ah, I see you've met Sirius. He's been nice enough to give us his old home," Dumbledore said kindly. Sirius merely nodded. He was still staring at Harry, making Harry a little uncomfortable. Hi," he said. Nodding to Sirius and sitting back down. "I'm Harry." But he probably already knew that. He still wasn't used to this whole fame thing yet. "I know," Sirius said with another smile. He walked across the dining room and sat across from where Harry was sitting. Harry inched away a little, his guard still strongly holding up. Sirius pointed to Harry's food. "Aren't you hungry?" He looked down at his food stupidly. He'd completely forgotten all about it. "Lost my appetite," Harry said briefly with a shrug. "But you need to eat," Molly interjected, walking the length of the room to give Sirius a plate of food equally vast. "You look so thin and, well, you just look malnourished, dear. Eat up." "She has a point," Sirius added quietly, as though he regretted saying it. But who did they think they were, his parents? He had gone from the Dursleys not giving a shit about him, to people who were actually forcing him to eat. The Dursleys preferred him not eating, and sometimes he'd been thrug. Periods of starvation is a form of punishment. I'm really not hungry, Harry insisted. Harry experienced sight-along apparition, Dumbledore said, as though this was the only possible reason he could lose his appetite. Nothing to do with Voldemort or anything, not at all. Sirius nodded, but Molly didn't seem to be happy with this explanation. Do you two not see just how awful he looks? I don't care if he's apparated from across the world, the boy needs to eat. Harry gave a defeated sigh and began slowly picking at his food, and it was fucking delicious. Appetite or not, he found himself eating more uncontrollably. Maybe this place wasn't so bad if it had lots of delicious food, even if that man named Sirius did keep staring at him like he had never seen another person before in his life. There was a long minute where there was complete silence other than Harry eating as quickly as possible because he'd never tasted food like this before. Aunt Petunia's food was crap compared to this, any food was crap compared to this. I've explained mostly everything to Harry, Dumbledore announced, uncovering the blanket of silence that had covered them all. And I've got his guardian's permission to attend Hogwarts. Molly clapped her hands together and beamed at him. Oh, Harry, that's wonderful. You'll meet my kids tomorrow. Ginny's a year below you, and my twins, Fred and George, are 2 years older. Ron is your age, and I'm sure you'll all get along just fine. Great. While Harry didn't completely mind Molly, he didn't give a crap about her kids. If they looked anything like her, Harry would be surrounded by tons of gingers for God knew how long. Would they swoon over him because he was famous? Would they avoid him if he looked just as awful as Molly said he looked? Although, really, this wasn't a huge problem. Everything that would have been a problem for him before the graveyard now just seemed like minor worries now, nothing compared to what he'd lived through in the graveyard. Hogwarts sounded interesting the way Dumbledore described it, composing of 4 houses. Harry's parents had been in Gryffindor, which automatically made him feel like he needed to be in that particular house. With each houses having their own common room and dormitories, which meant that being chosen for a certain house meant literally living with the same people from that house. Harry had been too scared at the moment, and he still was a little scared, to ask if he was going to be thrown into the curriculum just like every other student. We will have a special schedule set up for you, of course. Dumbledore said, as though he had read Harry's mind. Behind him, Molly was hastily making more food. It seemed like there was far too much food, even if there were other people in the house cleaning it up. It was as though this was her big distraction, and she'd continue to cook for as long as needed that. Harry couldn't blame her, he wouldn't have minded a distraction of his own. We will put you in the same classes as other 5th years, but once I have informed them of your situation, I assure you that all of your teachers will, what did they say? Go easy on you for the first few months. You will have private lessons with each teacher for 30 minutes each, primarily covering the basics. And of course you'll be expected to study in order to catch up as quickly as possible. Harry nodded, barely taking in anything but appearing like he did. If he was being completely honest with himself, he didn't give a shit about school. It was always the least of his worries. Even when he was at a normal high school. He wasn't even sure if he was going to be able to perform magic, since he seemed too nervous around it. How was he supposed to fit in with these people if he couldn't perform magic? Maybe he didn't really belong here. And why were they all beating around the bush? Hadn't Voldemort returned? Dumbledore said that Voldemort had been at large before. Harry had apparently destroyed him as a 1-year-old, and so Voldemort's last victims were James and Lily Potter. It still blew his mind. Where were the teams of good guys assembling to take him out? Or were they too busy cleaning the stupid house? None of them understood just what Voldemort was like, what a threat he was. Had any of them, besides Dumbledore, as he'd told Harry of his encounters with the enemy, even met Voldemort face to face? At least, if they did, they had magic on their side. Harry had been completely defenseless. What's gonna happen now? Harry asked in the silence. He didn't want to be treated delicately, he wanted to know exactly what was going to happen. I just explained it to you, Harry, Dumbledore said calmly. No, not about Hogwarts. All 3 of the adults in the room must have understood what he meant. Molly dropped another plate, although she was careful to pick it up manually, seeing as Harry would have jumped at any performed magic. Dumbledore closed his eyes and looked like he was in some kind of disturbed slumber. Sirius just gazed at Harry, open-mouthed. Finally, Dumbledore spoke. "Nobody knows. Nobody knows," Harry repeated. "What? How could you not know? Voldemort's back. You've got to do something." "Defeating Voldemort is not as easy as it may seem," the elder wizard said somberly. "With him fresh in your memory, I'd imagine you would understand that. For now, we are setting up a headquarters, this house, and trying to get as many people on our side as possible before the Ministry discovers what's happened to you." "But wouldn't you want them to know what's happened?" Harry asked. "Wasn't the Ministry on the same side as this Order thing? All of them good, fighting evil." "I'm afraid that not everyone will believe the truth," he said. "You don't know that," Molly said quietly from her island of food, as though she was trying to convince herself of this. "Molly, if you believed in the Ministry's cooperation, then you would. Inti have come here when I summoned the Order," Dumbledore told her. She was silent. "Why wouldn't they believe us?" Harry asked. "Us? He'd never belonged to an us, except when he led his own gang, you. And fortunately second best to Dudley's, through school and during free hours when he wasn't stuck in detention." "Fear," he said simply. "They'd be too afraid to admit that he's back. Especially Fudge, the minister. He wouldn't want to have the responsibility of fighting Voldemort." Harry put his elbows on the table and leaned forward, pulling at his own hair to keep him from shouting choice words at the Ministry's actions. "So only the Order would believe him. The Ministry would not. Without the force of a government to fight Voldemort, what were the chances of him being defeated? This magical world turned out to be just as full of shit as the normal world, with the only positive point being that he was away from the Dursleys, possibly until the following summer. The only negative point of summer was that she still didn't get any sleep, but Hermione already couldn't wait until the following summer. It was an hour too late for her parents, and so they were already asleep. 9 o'clock was too early for Hermione. It seemed like every hour circling the clock was too early. She was sitting on her bed, leaning against the headboard and reading. Her eyes scanned each line but she absorbed nothing. After a few more minutes of this, she put the book down and walked across her room to the one window that opened her eyes to the outside world. The sun was far gone, being replaced with stars and the moon. Hermione pressed her head against the coolness of the window and drew a small heart where her breath condensated the glass, force of habit. Another long night was waiting for her. Over the last school year, she waited in the common room or the library every night, whichever was less crowded, until at least midnight. When the tower was silent, she'd finally retreat to the girls' dormitory, where she would thankfully encounter sleeping versions of the very people she feared daily. She woke up early, too, and her morning routine required little, so she was out of the dormitory before the other girls could awaken from their caskets to haunt her. Sometimes, she'd fall asleep in the common room instead, only to wake up to some sort of trap waiting for her, set by the boys from her year. She never won. As a result, she developed dark circles under her eyes, but it was better than facing the girls in the dormitory. Hermione had already admitted to herself how cowardly it was. But she couldn't help it, she always needed to hide. When she returned for the summer, she thought that she could count on catching up on all of the sleep that she'd lost. But as it turned out, it had become a dangerous habit of hers that was unable to break. No matter how much she tried, she couldn't fall asleep before midnight. She couldn't even rely on sleeping in, her biological clock woke her up at the same time she'd woken up on school days. Most nights, though, she didn't even get the luxury of falling asleep at midnight, her mind wouldn't rest until several hours after that. So, it was no use. Her desperation for hiding had turned her into someone with a mild case of insomnia. It was now messing with her overall health, and she couldn't stop it. Although her mother, Jane, pointed out the dark circles under her eyes, she never stopped to consider just what those dark circles really meant. And Hermione wasn't ready to reveal the problem just yet. After all, she would be out of school in a few years. And then her sufferings would end. "This is fucked up," Harry said, still gripping his own messy hair to prevent even more curse words from spewing from his mouth. "Please don't curse in front of me, Harry," Dumbledore said, like a robot for the third time. But I will agree with you in some sense. This certainly is a sticky situation. A sticky situation, Harry repeated, not even able to look at any of them but keeping his gaze on the table. Voldemort's out there. He's out there, and you're all standing there like nothing's wrong. We all know that that's not the case, Harry. Dumbledore began, but Harry cut him off, no longer being able to take this bullshit anymore. You don't know. None of you know what it's like to face him while being completely defenseless. I had nothing to protect myself, he just took advantage of me. You don't know what it's like at all, you don't even know what I was forced to see and hear. He just used me like some sort of puppet. You don't know what shit I had to go through, what pain I felt, so don't pretend that you understand because you don't. Molly had distanced herself from him but gave him a sad look with watering eyes. An expression of obvious sympathy, and he wanted to wipe it right off her face. Sirius and Dumbledore remained calm and unchanged, as though they had expected this outburst all along. RRY was nearly pulling his hair out from the roots by the time he finished. His breathing was heavy and his lungs were on fire, his throat felt torn open, with bleeding wounds. His heart was beating out of his chest. There were even more wet stains, a product of sweat, around the collar of his shirt. He felt relieved that he'd finally spoke up all of those bottled words, even if the atmosphere was more tense than ever now. They needed to know just how much hell he had had to experience, because none of them could possibly grasp the concept of Voldemort's danger. We're not saying that we understand you, the man named Sirius said, who was the last person Harry had expected to speak up. We could only imagine what you've been through, and we all know it's not fair that this happened. He looked up to finally look the man in the eyes, and saw that Sirius must have had some unfair things happen to him, too. Maybe he was handsome at one point in his life, but now, nobody looked that gaunt and worn if they'd led a great life. And his attempt at reasoning with Harry was so unexpected that Harry didn't even find himself shouting back in anger. Instead, he nodded to show that he was calmed down, for now. I agree with Sirius, Dumbledore said. It was not fair whatsoever. I assure you, though, that you're safe here. This house has many spells that prevent it from being seen from Death Eaters or even Voldemort himself. That's impossible, Harry muttered through gritted teeth, his breath still heavy. Dumbledore was getting ahead of himself by saying that even Voldemort couldn't see this house. That was just ridiculous. If Voldemort wanted to get to Harry, he would. He told Harry himself. Oh, I'm sure you'll soon find that nothing is impossible here, the elder man said calmly. You must be exhausted, you poor thing, Molly interjected, clapping her hands together and forcing a smile. Her eyes showed the opposite, she clearly still looked upset, and Harry wondered briefly if she, all along, knew the dangers of the situation they were being forced into. There's a guest bedroom right on the first floor, I can show you where it is if you'd like. I'm not tired, Harry lied. He was just too afraid to fall asleep. He didn't want to relive the graveyard in his dreams as well. Are you sure? Molly asked hesitantly. You really do look terrible, sweetie. I think you should get some rest. To take your mind off things for a little while. All of this, sweetie, and, you poor thing, crap was really driving him up the wall, so he was barely able to keep a calm expression when he declined with, no, thank you. Harry ran his fingers through his hair anxiously without even realizing it, as it was a force of habit, but when he heard Molly scream, oh my. He immediately put his hands back by his sides and looked around. But once again, Molly was walking towards him with that worried expression possessing her features. Oh God, what now? She walked on the length of the table and sat on the table beside him, facing him and grabbing his arm. Oh, dear, you're bleeding, she exclaimed. Would you mind if I healed this with magic? It won't hurt, I promise, it's just easier that way. Harry looked down and saw dried up and fresh blood mixing in some grotesque, crimson wash over his forearm, where Wormtail had taken his blood. The long, jagged cut brought him back to the graveyard to relive how painful Wormtail had made it. He was practically hellbent on reaching Harry's bone, making the injury extremely painful. Just one small slice to extra. Quart a little amount of Harry's blood was clearly not enough. He made the process more excruciatingly painful than it needed to be. He'd also had a fair share of injuries everywhere else, but they were mostly bruises. But his body had been blocking out a lot of physical pain, possibly from shock. If only his body could block out the memories as well. It's nothing, Mrs., he began, not sure of what to formally refer to her as. Her sad eyes and possible understanding of what was going on made him feel like he owed her at least some respect. You can call me Mrs. Weasley. It's nothing, Mrs. Weasley, he corrected himself. Are you sure? I can fix everything up within a second with magic, Mrs. Weasley said urgently, searching him for more injuries. Do you have any more cuts? Any bruises? She lifted up the rest of his sleeve, pulled up his shirt, and gave him a huge examination right in front of God and everybody. He pulled his shirt back down. He didn't like being touched. Harry quickly slid away from her, saying, No. I'm fine, thanks. Can I have a moment with Harry? Sirius asked a few minutes later, after Mrs. Weasley would not settle with Harry's rejections. Her eyes swiveled to Sirius and gave him a fiery stare. She placed her hands on her hips and opened her mouth to speak words Harry wasn't sure he wanted to hear, but Dumbledore cut her off. Of course you can, Dumbledore said kindly. But you said, Molly, I'm sure that Sirius is at liberty to tell Harry whatever he wishes. He, out of all of us, deserves to talk to him. Dumbledore nodded to Harry and Sirius and then left the room. A disgruntled Mrs. Weasley following behind him and shutting the door a little too hard. Thanks, Harry said quietly. Thanks. That was a word he'd rarely ever used. Why assumed that Sirius just asked for time with Harry so that Mrs. Weasley could leave and stop being so persistent. In fact, while Harry was a little unnerved while being in a room with a stranger, he felt like he could relate to him. I'm sorry, was what Sirius ended up saying, rather than a quick, oh, you're welcome. He did, in fact, look sincere. His haunted eyes had even darker shadows now. Wait, what? Harry asked. What was he apologizing for? I'm sorry that I wasn't here for you in the first place, he said somberly. Harry just stared at him, confused. He willed Sirius to continue, because I was a friend of your father's. And God, you look just like him, except your eyes. You have Lily's eyes, Sirius began slowly. You knew my dad? Harry asked with wide eyes, and Sirius nodded, so he added, prove it. Harry hadn't expected anything, but instead, he saw Sirius reach into his robes. Harry remained still for fear of what was going to happen next, and pulled out what seemed like a small piece of paper. Until he turned it over for Harry to see, it was a picture. But it wasn't a normal picture. The people in it were moving, and once Harry had gotten over that, he saw that one of the people in the picture looked like an older version of Harry, with the same nose, ears and mouth and the same jet black, messy hair. That must have been his dad. All his life, he never knew what he looked like. He had always imagined, but he never really knew. But now he did, and the woman to his right must have been his mother, with the same exact eyes as Harry. She had long, red hair and a pretty face. And she was smiling at the camera. Harry felt a chill run down his spine. It was as though she knew it was him, looking back at her. And the man to James's other side looked like he was laughing. And he was handsome, he was a happier Sirius. And just like that, Harry was converted. He was ready to believe anything this man would say. From what Dumbledore had explained to us in the past, the Dursleys seem like the worst muggles imaginable, and I'm sorry you had to live under their roof. I would have contacted you if I was able to. What do you mean? Well, I won't go into detail right now. Because you've been overwhelmed enough today. No, tell me, Harry said. He knew that he wouldn't be falling asleep for a while, anyways, because he'd be hiding from potential nightmares. And also, nothing could possibly surprise him anymore. He'd dealt with so much shit that he almost felt numb by now, rather than scared of every single thing. If Voldemort was to walk into the room that very minute, Harry would probably put his hands up in surrender without feeling a thing. Maybe it was better this way, maybe it was his mind's defense, to suddenly be numb to everything and willing to take on anything. Sirius sighed. I was locked up in the wizarding prison called Azkaban for a very long time for a mass murder I didn't actually commit. I only just got out 2 years ago, when another good friend of your dad's put the pieces together while he was working at Hogwarts. He found the real culprit, who'd been hiding in a certain part of Hogwarts to see if you'd show up there, on Voldemort's orders. His name was Peter Pettigrew, but his nickname was Wormtail. Wormtail, Harry repeated, clutching the arms of his chair tightly. You know him? Sirius asked with one raised eyebrow. He's the one who got me into the graveyard in the first place, and tied me up when we got there. Harry hadn't actually told Dumbledore that he'd been tied up. In fact, he didn't tell Dumbledore a lot of the details about what had happened, and luckily the Elder Wizard didn't push for those very details. Somehow, though, Harry found himself revealing the events to Sirius like it was no problem at all. And, Harry continued, swallowing hard, he cut off his own hand, like he was sacrificing it to Voldemort, and he took my blood, too. That's how I got that cut. Sirius looked at the cut oddly. Then spoke. He committed the real mass murder, yet I was charged for it. I was stuck in the wizarding prison, so I couldn't contact you at all. I did manage to escape, although that is another story in itself, and so the media, of course, made it sound like a serial killer was on the loose. I couldn't go out in the open for anything. Once Remus told Dumbledore that I was innocent, they convinced me to stay here. And they put enough security measures around the place. So he'd been in prison. Harry was surprised at himself for not being alarmed by this. He knew that Sirius had been through a terrible ordeal. His worn face was more than enough proof. And if he'd really been on Voldemort's side, he would have handed him over already. Harry felt more comfortable here than he thought he would. Sirius wasn't beating around the bush or trying to tiptoe around Harry whatsoever, and he appreciated it. After all, he wasn't a kid. The graveyard had taken away whatever innocence he'd still had. Why did you need to be convinced to stay here if it's so safe? Harry asked. Imagine finally getting away from the Dursleys for good, and then years later having to return to the very house you hated. Sirius said with a pained expression. Oh, so Sirius didn't like his childhood house, either. But when Dumbledore started bringing up his theories about how Voldemort was slowly returning, the Ministry didn't believe him, and still won't, and so he had to make up his own plans. He said that the Order of the Phoenix needed to be reformed the moment Voldemort came back, not weeks later. He got enough people on his side, and then I offered to use this house as the headquarters. It was the least I could do, since I can't go outside without being caught. When he sent all of us letters that said Voldemort was back, half of the members rushed here, and they're all cleaning up the rest of the house. He also told us that you were coming along with him and that you were the one who witnessed Voldemort's return. So we knew it couldn't be good, but of course none of us have any idea exactly what you went through. And that one last sentence sent Harry over the edge. He told Sirius everything. He told him about the portkey in the beginning, how he'd ended up at the graveyard, how he was tied down and had his blood taken from him, then saw Voldemort return without knowing anything about him or what was going on, how he was tortured in front of Death Eaters, treated like a puppet, as everyone else laughed at his pain, how he had to listen to Voldemort's preaches about how he had been slowly returning and would finally kill Harry once and for all, everything. Sirius listened without interrupting him, although there were a few moments when he looked like he was going to say something. He stared at him with a blank face, although Harry could only imagine just what emotions were lying behind that plain mask. When Harry told him about the torture he'd endured, Sirius buried his face in his hands and didn't look Harry straight in the eye until the very end of it. It was painful at first to remember every detail, but at the end he felt a lot more relieved. It was nice to have finally let it all go. It was like releasing every pain he'd been suffering through for the past few hours. I'm so sorry, Harry, Sirius finally said. I could have been there for you all along. And you would have known about magic, you would have known about everything, and then you could have defended yourself. And I'm sorry. It's not your fault, Harry said weakly. No, it is. If I had cleared my name before Pettigrew escaped, then I could have signed. I think that's enough for one day, Mrs. Weasley's voice interrupted, and then Mrs. Weasley herself walked in, wearing that same expression she'd stormed out of the room with. Harry, you look worse and worse every second. Up to bed, dear. No, you really do need some rest, you look awful. Harry sighed and looked over at Sirius, who looked a million years older and more worn than ever. He surprisingly wasn't putting up an argument. After everything that's happened, you do need some rest. Harry finally stood up and allowed Mrs. Weasley to lead him to his new room. where, he felt, he wouldn't get any rest, but relive the graveyard another time in his nightmares. 2 nightmares and 1 regurgitation later, Harry decided to stay awake. Both of the nightmares were exact replicas of what had happened at the graveyard, and it was hard enough to not think about them while awake. He kept seeing Voldemort everywhere he turned, and even the quietest noise alerted him to danger. It was a relief to reveal everything to Sirius, but at the same time, he couldn't help continue to be paranoid. Was this the way he had to live now? Harry remembered being fearless. He remembered leading his own gang to everywhere and nowhere, just having a blast without much care for anything. He hadn't cared about grades, his many detentions, his record, or anything like that. That was what made the Dursleys so keen on disciplining him, not because they cared, but because he was an embarrassment to them. But all this time, they had never mentioned magic. And for some reason, he actually appreciated that one thing they did for him: keep magic at bay. Harry's life would have been so much easier without magic. There was no good magic, only dark magic. As Voldemort was only too happy to demonstrate, he used Harry as a puppet in a show with the Death Eaters as the audience, who could surprisingly laugh even with their black hearts. Harry wanted to rest, to finally slip away from the real world even just for a few moments, but he wanted to stay away from the nightmares even more than that. So he had sat on his bed in the guest bedroom, nervously looking at shadows. One positive thing about the whole situation was that he wasn't living in that bloody cupboard. He could sleep on an actual bed, not the sad excuse for a bed that he'd endured back on Privet Drive. It had been so unbelievably comfortable. Even if he had slept on the floor, it would have been better than a cupboard. He wished he could sleep properly to enjoy having a real bed to sleep on for once. At one point, the sun came up and its rays barely filtered through the grimy window, although somehow it was hope. Maybe an hour later, or 5 hours later, he wasn't sure, he heard Mrs. Weasley's voice downstairs and decided to finally move from his stiff sitting position and go into the kitchen. Although he had puked after reliving the graveyard, his empty stoma did not desire anything else to bother it. Harry sighed and stretched his back, then walked across the barely lit room on his way to breakfast. He felt his way along the hallways, still flinching at sudden movements and noises. And nearly tripped down the stairs, but finally, he made it to the closed kitchen door, where there were hushed voices speaking. "He's terrified of magic, Mrs. Weasley. Was she talking about him? Were people just as petty here as the residents of Privet Drive?" Not wanting to hear another word about him behind his back, Harry opened the door shamelessly and stumbled into the doorway. Sleep deprivation certainly had its setbacks. In the blinding light were Sirius and Mrs. Weasley, turning to look at Harry with surprised looks slowly composing into smiles. Behind T.H.M. were some random people with flaming red hair sitting at what must have been the long table. Harry rubbed his half-open eyes and finally got adjusted to realize that these random people must have been Mrs. Weasley's children, who looked tired, but not nearly as tired as Harry himself. They were all staring at him, their tired eyes widening to awake, shocked expressions. So this was Fame. It was like they thought he wasn't real. And all of a sudden, there he was. Even a part of Harry wished he wasn't real. Sirius nodded at him in acknowledgement and sent a genuine smile his way. Mrs. Weasley, meanwhile, crushed him in a hug and said, "Good morning, Harry. I was just about to send breakfast upstairs for you. I thought maybe you wouldn't want to be." She trailed off, leaning back to inspect I.M. and inhaling deeply before continuing. "Well, we're happy to have you here. And I swear, you've gotten thinner since a few hours ago. Did you get enough sleep? You look exhausted." "Yeah, I'm fine," Harry lied breathlessly, pulling away from her and running his right hand through his hair, which was messier than ever. "Those are the twins, better not be talking about a joke shop." Mrs. Weasley pointed to identical boys, who were the only children of hers who looked older than Harry. They looked at her with sympathetic expressions, although Harry knew those mocking smirks only too well, as he played that card with Aunt Petunia, not successfully. "That's Ron, he's the one I told you about, who's your age." She pointed to a boy who looked up at Harry and casually waved, only Harry didn't wave back. He had these stupid freckles on his face that would have made him look 5 if he wasn't so tall. Harry could tell that this Ron would start towering over him if he was standing up. "And that's Ginny, who's a year younger than you." Mrs. Weasley said, pointing to the only girl. Her cheeks became as red as her hair at the mention of her own name, and she looked at Harry for a second before shyly averting her gaze. You can sit right across from Ron, if you'd like, she continued. Before Harry had time to answer, she said, Great. I'm sure you two will be great friends. Sit. Harry reluctantly walked across the room and sat down across from Freckle Boy without looking at him and his stupid freckles. He turned around, looking for Sirius as Mrs. Weasley went to get him some breakfast. Sirius shrugged helplessly, then mouthed, We'll talk later. It was enough to make Harry somehow stay in his seat without protesting with all his might. The door opened once again, and a balding man with barely any red hair left, and wearing horn-rimmed glasses, walked in. His eyes immediately found Harry. Oh, Harry, this is my husband, Arthur, Mrs. Weasley said with a smile. Arthur, this is, well, you already know who he is. Yes, I do, the man, Arthur Weasley, said. He looked like he could also use some rest. He walked over to him and shook his hand. Nice to finally meet you, Harry. Within a minute, a huge tray of every breakfast dish imaginable was before him, and Mrs. Weasley's voice was urging him to eat as much as he possibly could. Eat everything in sight, Harry, you can even eat some of Ron's food. He needs to keep off the pounds for Quidditch, she said jokingly. At this, the kid named Ron's face went red. Ha. There were some comments from the twins, who were a few seats down. That made him even more flushed. He might have some competition, Molly, Sirius said, which Harry wasn't expecting. He snapped his head around to see that Sirius was pointing at him. James was a bloody good seeker. I'd imagine Harry would be just as good. Ron's going for keeper, Sirius, Mrs. Weasley said, a little defensive. Quidditch? Harry asked, racking his brains for any possible information on the subject. He remembered Dumbledore bringing it up a million years ago, in the foyer of number 4, Privet Drive, the house that he wouldn't have to rejoin until the next summer. Popular magical sport. Ron began to explain. Right, he said, remembering. Harry had never played any sports at school, but maybe things could change. Everything was going to change from now on. ... The boy who lived, a runaway. The famous Harry Potter, a mysterious boy who we've grown to love and thirst to know about, was missing from his home last night, and is still without a trace. The Daily Prophet, #1 selling wizarding newspaper in the UK area, has a full report that is nothing short of satisfying for our loyal readers and newcomers alike. Our suspicions are aflame. Where has he gone? What exactly happened? There are theories of Harry Potter running away from his residence that is located in a Muggle neighborhood. Motivation behind this action is unknown as of right now, but we can make assumptions. According to records, at around 10 o'clock last night Harry James Potter was granted permission to attend Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. His permission slip that all of his previous and current Hogwarts students remember clearly was signed by a guardian, the boy's Muggle uncle. The Ministry of Magic cannot seem to see a distinct loophole through this authentic signature. There is no explanation as to why Harry Potter's uncle decided just recently to give him permission. The moment the slip was signed, in a way it magically bound Mr. Potter to Hogwarts, and so ministry officials arrived at his residence an hour after he was granted permission to attend Hogwarts. But when the officials got there, the boy who lived was nowhere to be found. His relatives, who were fully aware of the wizarding world, were less than cooperative. Why did he run away? Perhaps he found out about the magical world and did not find it favorable, even if he was allowed to go to Hogwarts. The boy could just be scared, Minister of Magic, Cornelius Fudge, told the Daily Prophet. Of course there is nothing magical out there that would want to hurt him, but naturally want to take a precaution. Muggle dangers are more of a threat in a sense. His whereabouts are a priority. Perhaps, when this is all over and we find him, he will finally get the praise he deserves for defeating he who must not be named. This 15-year-old is out there, somewhere, and we encourage everyone to keep their eyes peeled. It's very important that he is found. If you, or someone you know, have any information on Mr. Potter's whereabouts, then please do not hesitate to contact the Ministry of Magic immediately. Rewards are held in place for someone who has accurate details on where Harry Potter may be. In the meantime, we're on the edge, dying to know more. Keep your eyes open for more upcoming news on the matter exclusively from the Daily Prophet. For the rest of this article, go to page 2. For excerpts of previous articles in the Prophet about Harry Potter, go to page 3. For short biographies on James and Lily Potter, go to page 5. For quotes accumulating over the years about Harry Potter, go to page 7. For quotes accumulating over the years about you-know-who, go to page 8. For skeptical sightings of Harry Potter, go to page 9. For actual sightings of Harry Potter, these may or may not be actual sightings and are not completely reliable, go to page 10. For opinions from Hogwarts students about Harry Potter, go to page 12. What's wrong? Carl asked. Hermione finally put the newspaper down so that she was able to look at her father, tearing her eyes away from the revolutionary news article. What? No, nothing's wrong, Dad, she said breathlessly. You usually don't read that paper, you just skim it quickly then throw it away, he noted. It's important to know the enemy, she said knowledgeably. She slid the newspaper away from her and Dee sipped a cup of coffee. It was a stupid American drink that tasted absolutely awful, but it was the only thing that kept her awake. Hermione had endured yet another sleepless night. I usually just skim it because it's full of rubbish. Unfortunately, a lot of people believe the stuff that's on here. Carl nodded and then hesitated before asking, what was so special about today's paper? He took a bite from his piece of toast and rubbed his eyes behind his spectacles. Harry Potter is missing, Hermione said with a shrug of the shoulders. She might have been the only person in the wizarding world who said his name that casually. It didn't even seem like much of a big deal in plain words, Harry Potter is missing. In a way, he'd been missing for a very long time. The Daily Prophet is under the impression that he ran away. Harry Potter. Carl moved his lips soundlessly, clearly trying to stir his memory at such an early hour. Oh, right. The boy with the scar. You've told me about him. Isn't he your age? Yes. So you've met him? No. Carl looked at her strangely and took another small bite of toast, once again deep in thought. Well, Hermione went on, when he was younger, he defeated Voldemort. This really evil wizard who I've told you about. But then Harry had to live with his Muggle relatives and nobody's heard from him since. Apparently the Muggles didn't want him to go school. But they gave him legal permission last night. And now he's missing. Missing. You don't seem too alarmed. Hermione shrugged. I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for his disappearance. There was always something that the Daily Prophet failed to let the public know. Explanations were lacking. There was just enough information to keep someone assuming, but not enough to keep them informed. The way they mentioned Muggle dangers was bollocks. Magical threats were always far, far worse. The Ministry just did not want to insinuate anything even mildly related to Lord Voldemort, whom Professor Dumbledore claimed was slowly gaining power. While nobody else seemed to believe the headmaster and his theories about Voldemort slowly coming back to power, Hermione foo. Nd every word of his to be the entire truth. It was one more thing that made her less favorable amongst the other students at Hogwarts. She remained casual about the situation and didn't want the Daily Prophet's perception to worry her. There was a reason for all of it, right? Yet somehow the thought of Voldemort rising back to power and Harry Potter's disappearance being linked twisted her stomach uncomfortably. She took another sip of her coffee before contorting her face in disgust at the taste. She silently prayed that the caffeine would kick in soon. The circles under her eyes were deep shadows, reflecting her lack of sleep. They fell into a comfortable silence. The two were not the most sociable people under the sun. Hermione kept taking daring sips of coffee, her tired mind still rode at work to contemplate Harry Potter's kidnapping. She wondered if she would see him at school. After all, there was a reason behind him being given permission to attend Hogwarts. Maybe he'd come to terms with his part in the wizarding world and be more than happy to be involved in it within the next couple of days. And what if he was at school? Everyone would go gaga over him, of course. Maybe that would take the attention away from her, even for just a moment, and then perhaps she could fearlessly go to the girls' dormitory earlier and fall into a better sleeping habit. Just maybe. For most of the day, Mrs. Weasley had tended to all of Harry's injuries. In deep confidence, Mrs. Weasley had told Sirius that there had been very old bruises and scars that weren't from the graveyard. It didn't take a genius to realize that the Dursleys had left their own marks on Harry before letting him live amongst his own kind. But Harry had never revealed to Sirius what really had happened under the Dursleys' roof. He might have relived the graveyard for him, but his life with his aunt and uncle were a secret. Sirius's heart had been empty for a long time, but then he met Harry. At first, all Sirius could see James's son. James's hair, James's everything. He saw James everywhere. But Harry was different. Harry was broken, brought up by a family that had never loved him, a reflection of a wounded past. He still had the determination and strength of James, but somehow, even that was different. He was stronger. He had to be that way. The moment Sirius had showed Harry the picture of him with James and Lily. He'd gained Harry's trust. He guessed that gaining this young man's trust was one of the world's greatest triumphs. He wished he hadn't met his godson, Merlin, his godson, the way he had, after such a tragedy. But at least they had finally met. Hearing the truth of what happened in the graveyard made Sirius realize that Harry was perhaps the strongest person he'd ever met. RRY had choked out accounts of being tortured by the Cruciatus curse for what had, in his tortured mind, seemed like hours. There were gaps of space where Harry didn't include too much detail, but Sir Hughes could respect Harry not wanting to reveal every single detail. His great escape was certainly due to not only his skill but Voldemort's miscalculations and underestimation of Harry. Sirius had imagined that anyone in Voldemort's presence would have been through a lot, but Harry's story of the graveyard was unique. He'd been used as a defenseless puppet for hours on end. It was a shock just to see the young man standing on his own after what had happened. Sirius hadn't told Harry that he was his godfather yet. He'd been absorbing enough about this new world. It could wait. And if Sirius did, feel it was right to tell him by the time Harry hopped on the Hogwarts Express, then oh well. Why did it matter, really? It was just a title he'd wanted to use to his advantage to give Harry permission to go to Hogwarts. But it proved to be useless. Harry didn't need more on his plate than he already had to deal with. When the time was right, he'd reveal their link as godfather and godson. Until then, Sirius was perfectly happy with just being able to talk to Harry. And they did talk, just as Sirius had promised. That evening, Harry and Sirius sat across from each other in the bare-used living room as everyone else in the household was in a meeting in the kitchen. Members of the Order weren't as numerous as everyone had wished, but it was a start. There was talk, always talk. Talk of Voldemort, of Death Eaters, of linked disappearances, talk of the graveyard. Luckily, he'd managed to slip away from the talk for a few moments to get to chat with his godson. His godson. It was still unbelievable to see Harry. Right there, sporting bandaged injuries that made the look in his eyes rougher than should have ever belonged to a teenager. But that wasn't a teenage soul behind those green eyes. Just look at those stitches, you'll impress girls in no time, Sirius had joked when he saw the result of Mrs. Weasley's obsession over Harry's wounds. Harry had then told him, in a low whisper, as though the house could hear him, how he'd been with girls before, the easy kind that weren't looking for anything emotionally deeper than a nice snog, but had never had a steady relationship. This surprised Sirius, as he thought the kid would have good morals, just like James, but he supposed that his life back at Privet Drive required that type of careless mindset. Or maybe the kids were just getting crazier and crazier these days. God, he was getting old. Or, at least, old enough that his best friend's son was 15 years old already and standing at nearly Sirius's height. 15 years. That meant 14 years ago, James and Lily were taken from Sirius by Voldemort's infamous wrath. That was when Harry's and Sirius's free lives ended. Harry was given to the Dursleys, and Sirius was soon to be sentenced to Azkaban. As they sat across each other now, in a comfortable silence that seemed to relax Harry, Sirius spoke up about something he'd been on the fence about confronting. Harry, I have something to show you. Harry looked up from the fireplace, the fiery reflection gone from his eyes, and said, okay. The ease of that one word was unexpected. It really did seem like Harry trusted Sirius, and he wasn't about to mess that up. Slowly, Sirius extracted the newspaper article from his pocket, careful of his godson's reaction. But Harry didn't budge. He just watched curiously without any doubts flickering across his hardened face. Sirius handed over the article wordlessly, and Harry accepted. The young man's eyes scanned the headline with wide eyes. He looked up at Sirius questioningly for a moment, but then looked down to continue reading. That Daily Prophet article had been thrown away by an angry Mr. Weasley, who read the headline aloud. That shouted, "The boy who lived, runaway." Sirius had snatched it up from the trash and read it over. He felt that it was important for Harry to know what the other students at Hogwarts were going to think of him because of this article. They'd all be confused and ask questions, and wouldn't know about Voldemort. He needed to know what to expect, after every unexpected thing that had happened over the last 24 hours. Finally, Harry looked up from the article with shaking hands. They think I'm a runaway?" he asked. They don't know about Voldemort." He looked down and anxiously ran his fingers through his hair, making it messier than usual, but he didn't seem to care. He didn't seem to care about anything. "I thought you should be prepared," Sirius told him. "I didn't mean to make you upset." "I'm not upset," Harry said with a forced laugh, looking back up at him. "Why would I be upset?" That was rhetorical. "It's just," he continued, shaking his head in disbelief. "Nobody will believe me. You know, about Voldemort. I thought that you lot would be smarter than this," he referred to the newspaper, "to believe this shit." "You lot?" Sirius stared at Harry. "You know that you're a part of us, right?" he asked his godson. "It's not you lot. You're with us. Together." Harry shook his head again but didn't look at him. He stared off into the shadows of the room. And Sirius could only imagine what Harry's mind was making him see in the corners of creeping darkness. "I don't belong here. Don't try and tell me that I do, because I don't. I can't even watch magic happen without freaking out. So how am I supposed to live in a world of magic?" He paused, still looking at shadows with that indescribable look in his eyes. "I don't even belong in the Muggle world. I don't belong anywhere. You do belong here," Sirius said, sounding on the verge of pleading. He needed his godson to understand how important he was. Sirius couldn't lose him now. He'd just begun to know the young man. "Your parents were great at magic." "No, not great, they were incredible. I know that you're confused and feel lost, but, Harry, do you trust me?" Harry looked up from the shadows and blinked before nodding. Yes. Again, his trust was so easily found in that word. It made Sirius miss him already. "Then trust me, and believe me, when I say that you belong here, with us. Just hang in there. Everything will work out. Maybe not today, and maybe not tomorrow, but one day you'll realize that you belong here. Can you promise me that you'll at least wait it out?" Harry seemed as though he was going to protest, but he kept his jaw shut and wordlessly nodded once again, still not looking at him. It sent a wave of relief through Sirius. He trusted Harry as much, and maybe more, than Harry trusted him. His godson wasn't going anywhere for now. He'd wait it out. That's all he needed. There were dark circles under his eyes, reflections of his experiences. Harry's eyelids would occasionally begin to fall, but he'd shiver and they'd open again, revealing his bloodshot green eyes. It seemed as though Sirius wasn't the only one staying up at night. "Did you get any sleep last night?" Sirius suddenly asked without thinking. His brows knitted together in concern. There was another thought on his mind that had been bothering him that whole day, and it was about time to reveal his concern. "Mrs. Weasley was cleaning up your bedroom and saw that you'd thrown up." He didn't ask Harry why he hadn't reached out to someone for help after throwing up. He wouldn't bother him about not asking for assistance. The young man had lived his whole life without help. Sirius wasn't going to expect him to ask for a helping hand. Harry sighed, but didn't look guilty. He shrugged. "I fell asleep twice. But I didn't like the nightmares. They're too realistic." Just the thought of what Harry must have relived made Sirius shudder. Why did this have to happen? Why was Harry plagued by Voldemort as defenseless as a common muggle? Why did he have to see things that no human being should ever have to see? Harry looked like a child in that moment. His guard had momentarily collapsed after he revealed what had been really bothering him when he fell asleep and become a victim to his tortured imagination. His rough exterior, enforced by his homely fae, had uncoiled and left the vulnerable Harry out for Sirius to see. He kept looking at those shadows, and maybe he was seeing things he didn't want to see. But he was trapped in his own mind. Maybe he wasn't looking anywhere. Before Hermione knew it, she was stepping out of the dressing room at a local boutique, where an anxious Jane Granger was waiting to see her daughter in a stupid pink dress. "Oh, you look beautiful, honey," Jane said. Hermione was sure she was lying, but she kept her mouth shut and turned to face the full-length mirror that showed a Hermione with dark circles under her eyes that clashed horribly with the light pink of her dress. She could hear the girls' voices in her head now. "Are you starving yourself now? Is she that desperate for attention? Is she that desperate for boys?" Hermione turned around awkwardly, by the request of her mother, and tried to feel anything from this dress. It wasn't too formal, but it wasn't too casual. It would have been beautiful, on someone else. She could imagine it on a pretty girl and was surprised that she wasn't even envious. She wasn't anything. She was just Hermione. "You don't like it." It wasn't a question. "No, it's okay," Hermione lied. "Don't lie to me." Hermione sighed. "Okay, I don't really like it," she admitted quietly. "You look beautiful, and you don't need a dress to bring out that beauty. Isn't that what I've been telling you for years?" Quote. Her mother had been trying to get confidence into Hermione in every possible way, pep talks, makeovers, new wardrobes, but no matter what, her attempts always failed and they both knew it. The damage done at Hogwarts just couldn't be healed. It was stuck with her. Hermione twisted at odd angles, a little embarrassed about looking at her reflection because someone might draw the wrong conclusion. And tried to find one angle where she actually looked nice. There was a small bow around her waist, which almost gave her curves, but it wasn't nearly goo enough to actually give such a good illusion. Even after her strict diet and exercise routine, she hadn't been hiding a perfect body underneath all of that baby fat. Her stomach was flat and her legs were strong. But that was the only appeal that she really found. The dress wasn't too revealing, but it also wasn't something a nun would approve of. It wasn't some sort of sultry, sexy, strapless strapless dresses just wouldn't work with her non-existent chest, and the plain pink fabric didn't have any sequins or a frilly hem, which might have been the only truly positive things about it. "Do I even need a dress?" Hermione asked. She was directing the question to anyone and anything, her mom, God, the world. Anyone who would listen and give her the answer she wanted. "It's just in Say you go to that Hogsmeade village you've been telling me about. Don't the girls at school wear clothes a little nicer than school robes?" Jane asked. "The girls at school? Who does she think she's trying to fool? What a sad excuse for a dress. Once again, she's trying too hard. I guess." Hermione shrugged. "Honey," Jane said softly, standing up and patting her daughter's shoulders. "I understand what you're going through." No, she actually didn't, but once again, Hermione kept her mouth shut. "You're going to find someone, one day, who will see your real beauty, inner and outer, and love you for who you are." It was a broken record lying to her over and over again. You'll find the perfect guy, someone will love you for who you are, there will be a person who will actually see your real beauty if they looked hard enough. Of course, Hermione had already accepted the reality of not having a boyfriend for a very long time. Hermione couldn't even look her mother in the eyes, so she remained still. Looking at her own reflection and knowing that no guy could ever love her for who she was, whoever she was. The next few days were the slowest 2 days of Harry's life. Time was slowly ticking on. Seconds graciously taking their time and hours never ending. He was thoroughly convinced that all of the clocks in number 12, Grimmauld Place were stuck just to mess with him. Harry wasn't even sure why he wanted time to hurry up already, but he did. Sirius was the only good thing about this stupid Grimmauld Place, while everyone else was tiptoeing around him, like he was the dangerous one. Sirius escaped order meetings as much as he could to spend time with Harry, and the two would talk about everything and nothing. While he impatiently waited for time to painfully wear on, Harry didn't know what there was to look forward to. Sure, there was school. When was school ever something to look forward to? It was bound to suck, even in this world. A small part of him believed that he was waiting to be healed. Couldn't time heal anything? When would life get easier? The whole 48 hours still were filled with worrying about Voldemort and constantly staying alert for anyone and anything. He got 2 hours of sleep before waking up from nightmares again, and the night after that was the same. It was useless to even try to get some rest, but he fell asleep without meaning to both times. Harry felt like his mind didn't even belong to his body while he sat in the guest bedroom most of the time. He wasn't aware of anything, he was just there, just Harry, sitting there and waiting for anything. Maybe it was permanent damage done by what happened in the graveyard, nothing physical, something that nobody could actually see and cure. There was a constant headache, and the awareness of its pain was taking up a lot of his thought process. The aching had its own rhythm, thump, 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 in his whole being, spreading through his veins like an epidemic, making him wish he stopped existing. If only to make the aching stop. He could barely hear what was going on around him, the shouts of Mrs. Weasley and the hushed voices of the Order and the conversation of the Weasley kids. It was all very far away. Harry had briefly wondered if there was some sort of magic that could help him stay awake, but immediately pushed the thought away, and it was never to be. He considered again. How could he think of something so dangerous? So stupid. He had never been the paranoid one, but he felt as though the person who had portkeyed into the graveyard was very different. From the person who portkeyed out of it. Okay, we've got your books, Harry. Mrs. Weasley announced the day before Harry and the Weasley kids were due to go to Hogwarts. There were dark circles under her eyes as well. And she seemed less alert than usual. It was as though Harry's restlessness was contagious. She was even trembling under the weight of just carrying one small book that was resting in her left hand, threatening to collapse beneath the book. My son, Bill. There were more of them. Works at Gringotts, the Wizard Bank, so he got some money out of your vault there and bought you a school trunk, all of your books. Your supplies. Wait, I have a vault at a bank. Harry interrupted her, stunned. Why couldn't I go and see it? Well, sweetie, Mrs. Weasley said slowly, fully placing his school supplies on the kitchen table, we're afraid we can't just let you wander around Diagon Alley, unless we want to make a scene with a team of Aurors around you. Aurors. Dark wizard catchers, she explained hastily. And people are starting to wonder things, so we don't want to make more speculation. Anyway, he got a receipt of all of the money in your vault you have, Jew. Saint, so that you're aware of how much you have. Is that okay, dear? Harry nodded, but he wasn't really sure what he was agreeing to. Did he really have money? It must have not been a lot, then. Maybe a few £100, if he was lucky. Here you go, sweetie, Mrs. Weasley said, handing him a parchment and returning to sorting out all of his school supplies in a dazed haste. And, galleons are our form of currency. Harry grabbed it and looked down at it, adjusting his glasses. His eyes widened at the numbers that were practically rolling off the paper. If galleons were any similar to pounds, he was rich. Harry was frozen in his spot, staring at the parchment stupidly and not believing that this all really belonged to him. How do I have all of this money? Inheritance, of course, dear, Mrs. Weasley told him, briefly glancing up to face him then returning to organizing the school supplies. Did you think that your parents left you with nothing? Harry opened his mouth to say something, but immediately closed it. His eyelids were drooping, slowly blurring his vision and making Mrs. Weasley not even look real anymore. He shook his head, which was really no use in the end, and continued to stare at the parchment as it slid in and out of focus. Nothing seemed like it belonged to reality anymore. Maybe, if all of this money really existed, then he could buy his own flat and be away from the Dursleys over the summer. Oh, dear, I nearly forgot, she said, chuckling although clearly nothing was funny. We wrote to Ollivander, a wand maker, and he's sent over a few wands for you to try out. I'll put them in your school trunk. You can wait until school if that's better for you, once you learn a spell to use, and send back the ones that don't work for you. Wait, what? Harry stared at her. He felt uncomfortable just thinking about holding a wand and performing magic. And what did she mean by ones that don't work for you? What would happen if a wand didn't work? It's nothing to worry about, of course, Mrs. Weasley said, setting up a few scales. She was still mechanically putting everything in its proper place and not looking at him, as though her mind was very far away. Mr. Ollivander claims that the wand chooses the wizard. You'd know if the right wand was in your hand. Nothing bad would happen if it just doesn't work for you, it just wouldn't feel right. Harry found this all hard to believe. He imagined that every wand wouldn't feel right. How could it feel right to perform magic? Oh boy, there's so much stuff. We got you extra books to study from, eh? I'm just trying to put these all back. Mrs. Weasley kept sighing, folding what might have been robes or cloaks or something, and put them in their own separate pile. She was a robot, slowly moving in a steady rhythm and mechanically putting everything right where it belonged, unaware of everything around her. What really caught Harry off guard was the little sobs that broke out from her. I'm sorry that these supplies are so last minute, Harry, she said quietly, addressing him but not really speaking to him directly. They're not sorted right. I need to put hem back together. I need to put all of this back together. She began to cry at this point, glancing at the supplies and still determined to sort them all out. Her hands were shaking and she nearly dropped everything she was holding. But she still didn't give up. I need to put everything back together. Harry would have kept to himself if it weren't for the persistent call of, Harry. From the kitchen. Sighing, he finally retreated from the guest bedroom and padded down the stairs cautiously before making his way to the kitchen, where he could hear loud conversation bursting from the room. Had anyone other than Sirius or Mrs. Weasley called him downstairs, he wouldn't have listened. He didn't owe the order anything. Sure, they believed him, but treating him like he was the dangerous one, just some tortured object, wasn't something that made them on his good list. He walked through the open doorway to find everyone scrambling for their things, eating bites of their breakfast here and there, and shouting at others to get out of their way. Harry dodged the Weasleys and managed to retrieve his school trunk, which was waiting for him, perfectly in place, courtesy of Mrs. Weasley, and away from the chaos. It was odd to see Mrs. Weasley again after seeing her cry like she had the day before. She seemed to be falling apart even more as she scrambled around, looking for something. Oh, Harry, Mrs. Weasley said above the other voices in fast conversation, finally noticing his existence. There you are. We're leaving in an hour, are you ready? Harry looked down. He had his clothes on his back and his school trunk. It was all he had. He nodded. Good, she said distractedly. The doorbell to the house rang, and at first Harry thought that it was Mrs. Weasley wailing, but it was a voice coming from the hallway. He shrunk away from the doorway cautiously as Mrs. Weasley ran out of the room and began to shout over a chorus of profanities that made Harry's vocabulary seem saintly. It sent a shiver down his spine. What the hell is that? Harry asked. Was it a new houseguest? Were they welcome? Sirius's mum's portrait, the boy named Ron said, shaking his head. Every time she wakes up, she starts yelling. Portraits talk. Oh, yeah, Ron told him matter-of-factly. Get on my bloody nerves sometimes, though. Especially the ones of dead people. It's just a bit creepy, you know. That's an understatement, Harry said, still very determined to keep a firm distance between himself and the hallway. Hey, want to be in the same compartment on the train? Ron read awkwardly above the shrieks of the portrait outside, his red ears screaming out embarrassment. The train. Dumbledore had told him that all of the students go to Hogwarts by train, and Harry had been on plenty of trains in his lifetime with his gang. At least there wasn't some sort of insane, magical transportation system to get to the school, like a freaking magic carpet or something. Harry could cope with that, at least. Yeah, sure, Harry said half-heartedly with a shrug. He supposed that he'd be stuck in a compartment with someone either way. Why the hell not? Where have you been? Mrs. Weasley's voice snapped over the screeching portrait. There were other voices trying to talk over her, but she cut them off. Never mind. Just get inside and we'll choose the best route to King's Cross. We need to leave in a few minutes. What do you mean? Moody couldn't make it. Ellipsis. Okay, very well. Yes, everyone's ready. Yes, Harry's all right. Just get inside already. Don't just linger out on the doorstep. The people Mrs. Weasley were yelling at listened and must have walked in, because the door closed a few moments afterwards. Harry stood there in anticipation. He looked over at Ron. That's the team of Aurors that are going to bring us to King's Cross, Ron told him. Harry had been told the details of their voyage to King's Cross the day before by Sirius, so he just nodded. Mrs. Weasley walked back into the room with a group of people following behind. They were all dressed in robes and when their eyes met Harry they immediately headed north, at his scar. He wished he could turn invisible. You have everything, right, sweetie? Yes, Mum, Hermione said quietly. Jane and Carl were in the front of their new car, their dentist salaries could afford such novelties. Although it didn't make much of a difference to Hermione either way, while Hermione sat in the back. She pressed her forehead against the cool car window. That, at least, kept her somewhat awake. We'll be there in just a moment, Carl noted. Thanks, Dad, she thought to herself, but she didn't dare speak the phrase out loud. The world whizzed by as they rode on, and Hermione's thoughts were going at that same speed. Her thought process wasn't too complicated, for all it really consisted of was school, school, school. The word kept spinning around in her head, teasing and taunting her. She could already hear the other students' laughter in her mind. She had that noise memorized by heart, unfortunately. There was no way to prevent what was going to happen, no turning back. Shish. He had to face yet another year at school. Nobody was going to save her from it, not even her parents, who were now smiling at her through the front mirror. Silent tears were slowly sliding down the side of her face. The product of just how upset she was about returning to the one place she hated the most. She wiped them away, but they kept coming back without her permission, cascading past the redibly dark purple circles under her eyes and past her face, dripping off her jaw and staining her shirt. But she didn't even care anymore. Jane turned to pull into the parking lot and said, "We're Air," the two worst words ever spoken that sent a chill up Hermione's spine. Her heart suddenly felt heavy, like it was sinking, along with any hope of staying with her parents rather than going to school. She was going to ask, in one last chance, to just skip this term, but her throat was dry and refused to utter any words. The three Grangers got out of the car, Hermione being the last one. She slowly took her time while retrieving her school trunk from the trunk of the car. That bloody thing made the situation all too real. This was really happening, she was really going back to Hogwarts. Come on, sweetie. Neville might be there already, Jane said quietly with a sad smile. She wasn't happy, of course, that her daughter would be gone until term ended and the holidays began. You brought that dress, right? Hermione, still not able to speak, nodded. She couldn't imagine actually wearing that stupid dress, but she put it in her school trunk anyways. Jane sent another sad smile her way. She wrapped one lean arm around her daughter's shoulders and led her to King's Cross, because Hermione honestly could not make the trip herself. Carl took Hermione's school trunk from her shaking hand and carried it for her as the trio entered King's Cross. Platform 1, 2, 3. Hermione could practically hear the other students' voices in her head already, muttering unspeakable things her way. She couldn't go back. 6, 7, 8. When she saw Platform 9, she was ready to make a run for it. Here we are, honey, Carl said, putting her school trunk down to embrace his daughter. Hermione hugged her father back, not wanting to let go, not wanting to leave him, or her mother. Jane made that sound of sympathy that only mothers could make, and Hermione wanted to cry. Her chin trembled as Jane embraced her as well. Hermione could smell her perfume, and that scent always brought her back to summer, the memories that she still had with her parents, away from school. But all too soon, Jane was breaking apart from her with tears streaking down her face and disrupting her flawless makeup, but she seemed beyond to care about what she looked like. "You'll write to us, won't you?" she asked. Of course she'd write to them. She wrote to her parents constantly while at school. It was an escape for her to read the words, real words, that her parents had written to her. And sometimes, she could smell the scent of her mother's perfume on the letters. "I'll write to you," Hermione said with a forced smile. It was nearly impossible to pretend to smile, considering how she felt. "Of course I'll write to you. We love you," Jane said before giving her daughter one last hug. She wiped her eyes and stammered, You have everything, right?" Hermione was about to say, "Unfortunately." But rather than making the situation worse than it had to be, she simply replied with, "Yes." Carl reached down and handed Hermione her school trunk as a group of people walked behind him and began to walk into the barrier themselves, Hogwarts students already. Hermione avoided looking at them, she didn't want to identify any familiar faces just yet. "Well," Hermione said quietly, looking down at her feet. "I guess this is it." Jane covered half of her face and nodded, and Carl smiled sadly. "This is it." Hermione turned, The group of people had disappeared past that brick wall already, and walked toward the barrier, alone. She turned around to glance at her parents once more but didn't bother to send them a fake smile. There was no use. She turned back, inhaled deeply, and walked into the barrier that separated the world she belonged to from the world she was entering. Harry was just getting used to daylight when they entered King's Cross. Of course. After being cooped up in number 12, Grimmauld Place. Seeing the light of day nearly blinded him, but it was a relief. There was something about soaking up sunlight that kept his spirits up enough to not collapse at the thought of Sirius not being there. Harry's departure from the only person he'd really trusted was enough to keep a cloud looming over his head as he walked with the rest of the group into the entrance of King's Cross. Harry had promised to write to Sirius the moment he got to Hogwarts. Sirius told Harry to use the codename, Snuffles, for him, and to use codenames for other things, as well. They had to be careful. And Harry didn't question him. It was too dangerous, Mrs. Weasley said, for Sirius to be with them for the trip, even under a disguise. Harry had asked what disguise Sirius had. But everyone refused to answer him, because he was afraid of magic. It seemed ridiculous, really, to attend a school of magic and be afraid of magic. None of it added up. Yet here he was, on his way to platform 9 3/4. There was a platform 9. He knew, and a platform 10, but platform 9 3/4. He didn't question it aloud. He learned to adapt to everything that was going on, to just accept this bullshit. He wasn't sure if he was ever going to really get used to it. Here we are, Mrs. Weasley announced to their group, which was basically a guard of Aurors. Harry stared at platform 9, then at platform 10. There was no platform 9 3/4. As he had guessed, they walked around a small, tight-knit family consisting of 3 people, that were all in Muggle attire, which was a relief to see, and talking amongst themselves. They all looked sad, especially the pretty girl that stood in front of who must have been her parents. "All right, Harry, it's just like I told you, you just have to walk into the wall. It seems silly, I know, but, well, let's have Ron demonstrate." "Ron, on it," Ron immediately said. He smiled at Harry, then ran headfirst towards the wall and disappeared. Harry's eyes widened. What the fuck? The other Weasley kids followed. Much to Harry's bewilderment, the other Aurors went as well, and the only people left were Harry and Mrs. Weasley. Every single one of them left him alone with Mrs. Weasley, every single one of them gone. "You first, dear," she insisted with a kind smile, urging him on. "What? Why? I'll be right behind you, I promise," Mrs. Weasley said. Her smile was faltering. "Do you trust me?" No. Sirius was the only person he trusted. Harry would have to write to him the moment he got to Hogwarts. Harry shut his eyes and ran towards the wall, expecting it to close on him and reject him. But before he knew it, he felt another atmosphere around him, and he heard a train. He opened his eyes, and yes, there was really a train. The Hogwarts Express. It was beautiful, red and shiny. Gleaming before the other people who were moving in throngs, rushing others onto the train. There were bustles of people moving around, departing from family or meeting up with old friends. He was here, and alive. Harry hadn't even realized it at first, but he was shaking. The feeling of walking through a wall was so surreal. Mrs. Weasley appeared next to him, causing him to jump. "Why? Oh, you didn't react as badly as I thought you would," she said over the conversation of others around them. Somehow, that didn't make him feel better. "There's everyone else, let's get on the train, shall we?" Harry was rushed to their group. And it was already disassembling, but Mrs. Weasley quickly stopped them. "Oh no you don't. Fred, George, and Ginny, you're not leaving without saying goodbye to your own mother, are you?" Ginny blushed red and ran to her mother, hugged her, said her goodbye, and parted. Just like that, Fred and George made their little comments and were hugged nearly to death before leaving as well. "Ron, why don't you and Harry get a compartment before people, you know?" She left her sentence hanging in the crowded air, and Harry raised an eyebrow at her but didn't say anything. Although quickly, he was starting to realize what she meant. Some people were already pointing at him. "Right," Ron said, still carrying his trunk. "Bye, Mum." He was pulled into a hug and Harry was just about to leave with him. Before Mrs. Weasley grabbed his arm. "You're not going to say goodbye?" she asked with a chuckle. Mrs. Weasley pulled Harry into a rib-crushing hug, and although it nearly suffocated him, it felt motherly. It ended all too soon, and she backed up to kiss him on the cheek. "All right, well, I'll write to Ron and see about you visiting us over the Christmas holidays," she said sheepishly. Wiping her eyes. Left with an odd feeling in the pit of stomach, Harry followed Ron to the express. "Thought she was going to kill you with that death-gripping hug," Ron commented. "But she's like that. She's grown quite fond of you, you know. Like you're another son, or something." Harry didn't know what to say to this, so he remained quiet as they walked up the steps to the train. There were people looking out windows and pressing their faces against the glass to get a better look of him. He wanted to tell them to fuck off, if only they could hear him through the glass. The train looked very much like an average Muggle train, which relaxed Harry immensely. He had been expecting doors to open on their own accord and different pieces of furniture to talk to him. There was even a woman pushing a cart. No magic required. "Bloody hell, practically every compartment is taken," Ron commented as they looked through the glass doors of compartments, searching for an empty one. "We're always late." People were staring at Harry as though he had three heads. Some people seemed torn between admiration and disgust, and others took strong sides. "Hey, that's Harry Potter." "What? Where? How do you know?" "I saw the scar. Blimey, he's here. Look, everyone. I thought he ran away." Students shamelessly stared after him, and Harry glared at them. Even Ron had a few dirty looks up his sleeves. There were two distinct actions of that the Hogwarts students had adopted: reuniting with friends, whom they hadn't seen during the length of the summer, or ogling at Harry's scar. Harry had originally thought the scar was cool before he found out what it had meant. Scars were always one of those things he was sure girls were attracted to, and while he never had a proper girlfriend, although he'd had his hookups occasionally, he'd spotted girls eyeing it enough to know that it was a magnet. But now, he wanted nothing more than to conceal it from everyone's eyes, even girls' eyes. Others just gasped, "Harry Potter," and he'd reply with, "Yes, that is my name," much to their surprise. Finally, they found an empty compartment, and they both happily walked in and closed the door behind them. It was quiet, for once. The entire train was lit up, no shadows to hide from. "What the hell was that?" Harry asked when they sat down and put their school trunks away. There were younger kids staring at them, wide-eyed, through the glass door, and Harry tried his best to ignore them. "It's crazy, I know," Ron said. "I mean, I was told I was famous, but this." Ron shrugged. "People just don't know personal boundaries, I guess." "Yeah, no shit," Harry commented, glaring at the clear glass of the door. He wished it wasn't so goddamn transparent. A few of Ron's mates walked in, trying to act casually surprised when spotting Harry, who was sitting across from him. There was Dean so-and-so and someone named Finnegan, or something like that. Just as they left, a stray-cord-looking woman practically ripped the door open, startling them both. The look on Ron's face betrayed that she wasn't too favored. She reminded Harry of his old teachers who knew his reputation only too well. It seemed that this one was aware of Harry's past, too. She was eyeing him as an eagle would watch over its prey. "Mr. Potter?" she asked, before her mouth transformed into a thin line once again around a few wrinkles. Yeah," Harry said awkwardly. Her small eyes focused on him and he felt like he was being searched under a huge microscope. Within a moment, she focused specifically on his scar. "Great. Come with me," she ordered. Her gaze meant that she was not to be challenged, and Harry did not feel very much like getting a detention already for disobeying anyone just yet. He stood up and followed her, turning to shrug at Ron before leaving the compartment altogether. Only when they began to walk the length of the train did he recognize the woman. Harry had certainly seen her at number 12. Grimmauld Place. They'd never formally met, but he'd seen her walk in and out of the house briefly. His brain racked to remember how the others had addressed her, Minerva. Was that it? So she was on his side. Even though she wasn't showing it. He didn't dare bring up the order out in the open, but he did find the trip across the express tolerable by that point. "I'm Professor McGonagall, the Transfiguration teacher at Hogwarts," the woman finally addressed herself, turning over her shoulder to glance at him before continuing on their trek to God knew where. The sorting T will sort you into the house that you belong to, she told him without looking at him. His insides squirmed. Dumbledore had told him about this. It's right in here, we have it on the train before arriving at the school for new students above first year. They walked into a fancier-looking compartment than the students' compartments. It was empty, except for an old hat placed on a rackety stool. It was only too familiar to the battered hat that'd been disguised as a portkey. He was supposed to wear that thing. Harry didn't even want to touch it, let alone wear it. It was even shifting now, Dumbledore had said it spoke. But seeing it right in front of him didn't make it any better. Well, go on, then, McGonagall said, gesturing towards the hat. I don't. She huffed and walked over to the hat to pick it up. And a part of Harry wanted to scream, no. She walked back to him and said, Potter, I understand that you're a little sensitive around magic, but this is a school of magic. You'll have to adapt. All you need is a little push. I can't, Harry told her truthfully, staring at the demonic hat. Potter, she said again, still holding the hat, it was too close, I'm sorry, I truly am, but you have to do this. It'll only take a moment. I promise nothing bad will happen. Harry sighed but didn't protest. He grabbed the doorknob behind him, just for good measure, as she placed the hat on his head. It began to talk. Harry Potter, it began in a rough, squawky voice. Harry reached up to take this thing off his head, but it wouldn't budge. He already wasn't feeling comfortable. Get it off me. The hat continued to talk like nothing was wrong, but everything was wrong. Potter, it's fine. McGonagall screamed after him, but nothing could calm him down. He still tried to rip off the hat as it continued to say words that Harry wasn't even paying attention to. Gryffindor. It roared, and finally allowed Harry to take it off his head. He tossed the hat across the room. It could have landed in a black hole for all he cared. He was just glad that it was gone. He clutched his chest, to see if his heart had exploded by now, and tried to steady his heavy breathing. There was cold sweat bleeding into the collar of his shirt. McGonagall picked up the sorting hat, the blasted thing, wordlessly, returned it to its stool, and studied Harry. They weren't lying, she said quietly. Although Harry was sure she wasn't addressing him. She cleared her throat and said, well, Potter, you're in Gryffindor. Congratulations. Deep down, that was the house he'd wanted to be in, as his father was in it. But after that encounter with the hat it hardly seemed worth it. Seeing as I am the head of the house, I will meet with you later at the school with more details on how your tutoring schedule will be worked out. You'll have a tour of the school as soon as I can get a prefect set up for the job. The priority here is for you to pass your OWLs, Importa. NT exams, coming at the end of the year. We'll be covering the basics for you, and of course you'll be expected to study. Welcome to Hogwarts. You may return to your compartment to share the good news of you being in Gryffindor with Mr. Weasley, she went on. Harry nodded, still out of breath, and opened the door to leave. As he turned to depart, he could have sworn he saw McGonagall bury her face in her hands. I'm in Gryffindor, Harry announced when he returned to the compartment. When he sat down, all he wanted to do was sleep without any nightmares. He felt exhausted from the sorting. His eyelids began to droop again. Ron smiled. Awesome. You know, I'm one of the Gryffindor prefects. Yes, there are prefects in this world as well, he added in response to Harry's confused look. Don, know why they picked me? I have a good idea who the girl prefect is, unfortunately. As if on cue, the compartment door opened. It was the girl from King's Cross. She still looked just as sad. She had long, wavy brown hair and big brown eyes that seemed too big for her little body. And those eyes went immediately to Ron. It was as though Harry wasn't even in the bloody room. She didn't actually enter the compartment, but rather lingered at the doorway, as though it were a boundary line separating them. Well, speak of the devil, Ron said, clearly displeased just by her presence. We were just talking about you. He pointed to Harry with his thumb. The girl's eyes swiveled to Harry only for a second before returning to Ron. She didn't even look at his scar. It was as though Ron hadn't spoken about Harry at all. I heard you were the other Gryffindor prefect, she said, almost as a question, in a shaky voice. Yeah, and what's it to you? Ron snapped. His tone seemed to startle the girl as well as Harry. The girl was clutching onto the side of the doorway as though she'd collapse if she tried holding herself up. "They want us to go to the prefect's compartment for a meeting," she said quietly. There were dark, almost frighteningly so, circles beneath her eyes, purple clashing with brown. They were even worse than Harry's own dark circles. Weakness was radiating off of her. Harry wondered why she wouldn't just look Ron in the bloody eyes and speak up. "Yeah, fine," Ron said gruffly, as though she'd been scolding him. "Whatever. I'll be there." The girl's eyes startled away from his tone and they momentarily landed on Harry, only she didn't ogle at him, and a second later her eyes were back on Ron, white and sad. "Well, what are you standing there for?" Ron asked, and she nearly jumped. "Weak. Fragile. I said I'll be there." She looked down, turning red, and walked out, gently closing the door behind her. Harry just sat there stupidly. It seemed like this school was more like a Muggle school than he had expected. "That's Hermione Granger," Ron told Harry, shaking his head. "Complete waste of space, if you ask me. Nobody likes her. Can't blame them. All she does is bloody read all day. Ridiculous." "Right. Yeah," Harry said without thinking, not sure of what he had just seen. Ridiculous. By the time Ron returned from his prefect's meeting, Harry was ready to stab someone. Did anyone care about privacy anymore, or was it just perfectly normal to gawk at Harry Bloody Potter through a glass door like visitors at a zoo? Why was this meddlesome attitude suddenly acceptable? He very much wished that he could just jump off the moving train, if only to escape the peering gazes from the other students. According to that goddamn newspaper article, Harry had run away from his home. The person he had been before the graveyard might have loosely fit the definition of what the adults called a delinquent, but running away. That was a whole new kind of rebellion. No matter how close everyone got to the glass door of the compartment, nobody actually dared to enter it, as though they were all afraid of making the first move. Harry finally had enough. He stood up and opened the door. And a few students moved back. Good. They should have moved back a long time ago. Does anyone give a shit about privacy? Harry spat at them all, his blood boiling. He grasped the edge of the compartment door, ready to slam it in all of their faces. "Yes, I'm Harry Potter, and no, I didn't run away, so can you just leave me alone?" Jesus Christ. He shut the door behind him and by the time he sat back down, most of the crowd had left, whispering amongst themselves. Thank God. The area around him was blissfully silent. Bloody hell. Ron exclaimed a moment later, returning from the meeting. "I know," Harry said, annoyed. He glanced back and glared at the few people who were still lingering, and soon they left as well. They all finally got away. "No, I wasn't talking about your stunt there. Although that was impressive. I was talking about the prefect's meeting. Prefects don't have to do patrols at night together." He let out a breath of relief as he sunk into a seat across from Harry. "So, that's good. It's not just good, it's great," Ron said. "I don't know what I'd do if I was stuck with Granger." "I mean, you saw her, right?" Harry didn't see anything wrong with the way she looked, other than those disturbing circles under her eyes that were worse than his own, so he didn't say anything. "Well, admittedly, she's better than last year," Ron recovered. "Must have starved herself or done something weird like that over the summer. You know how girls are, obsessing with their weight. And her hair is tame, not the bloody frizz she had before." Hermione let out a huge sigh of relief when she finally left the awful prefect's meeting. She had mainly sat in the corner, as far away from Ron Weasley and Draco Malfoy as possible. She didn't speak up at all. She merely remained in that one corner, as a shadow only to receive the occasional glare and snicker from Malfoy. How on earth Draco Malfoy ended up being a prefect was beyond her. The same went for Ron. Hermione was generally good with solving puzzles, but this had no clear, logical answer. She respected Professor Dumbledore, but really, how had this all happened? Becoming a prefect hardly seemed like an accomplishment compared to those two buffoons. Hermione walked the length of the Hogwarts Express feeling uneasy without a shield of books in front of her. All of her textbooks were in her compartment with Neville. But it seemed like she didn't need that shield, as the attention of the student body was focused elsewhere, Harry Potter. The majority of the students believed that he was a runaway. So it was obvious that they were surprised at his very presence among them, as an equal. A part of Hermione was thankful for the distraction. It allowed her to walk past several corridors without hearing too many distasteful insults heading her way. She planned on dressing into her school robes the moment she got into the compartment, because she felt too exposed wearing Muggle clothes. They weren't tight-fitting, but they certainly weren't as conservative as her robes. There were still glances, although comments were minimal, at her smaller frame, and she wanted to hide behind her school attire. The way Malfoy had looked at her in that prefect's meeting made her want to take a shower for hours. Hermione was in for comments on her new figure in the future, she just knew it. Unfortunately, Harry Potter's fame wouldn't be distracting forever. When she got back to her compartment, she closed the glass door and sat down, letting out a breath of air she hadn't known she'd been holding. "Hey, Hermione," Neville said, smiling. He still had that plant from his uncle cradled in his arms. "How was the meeting?" Hermione shrugged and half-smiled back. "It was all right. Patrols start tomorrow evening, and Ron and I don't need to do them together." Neville let out a sigh of relief. "Thank Merlin. I know. Hey, did you see Harry Potter? I heard he's in Ron's compartment." Hermione raised an eyebrow at him. "Yeah, I saw him when I got Ron for the meeting." Neville shifted in his seat and leaned towards her, clearly interested. "What's he like?" "Oh, not Neville too," she thought to herself. Hermione shrugged. "I didn't actually talk to him. But he seems, I don't know, he just seems off. Something's not right about him." She distinctly remembered the harsh look in Harry's eyes when she had quickly glanced at him in his compartment with Ron. He certainly wasn't the smiling hero that people had imagined him to be. Maybe he wasn't a hero at all. He had been a bystander while Ron snapped at her. It was moments like that, when Hermione couldn't stand up for herself, that made her question why she was a Gryffindor in the first place. Where did the courage part come into play? Hermione hadn't expected much more from Harry than to just watch the events unfold, and while he didn't join into Ron's tantrums, it was only a matter of time before he would. She didn't owe him any respect at this point. Neville stared at her. "Really?" Hermione nodded. "Odd. I don't know what I thought. But I definitely didn't imagine him to be like that," Neville said. "What house is he in?" "No idea." Neville looked out the window thoughtfully. "I hope he's in our house." "Oh, honestly, Neville," Hermione snapped, exasperated. Neville was her best and only friend. But sometimes he was just so thick. She'd never managed to have intelligent conversations, whether about academics or just life in general. Those kind of wonderful conversations were saved for her parents, who were probably almost back home by now. "Graham's a fan," he said quietly, shrugging his shoulders. She found that she had nothing else to say to him, and Neville seemed to think the same towards her. For the two then fell silent. They'd been friends for most of their Hogwarts years, but even now awkward silences fell between them. Hermione retrieved her school trunk and put on her robes over her Muggle clothing, hiding her body from everyone else's eyes. Much better. A silent hour later, the shortest hour of her life, the Hogwarts Express came to a halt after she'd spent what felt like seconds staring out the window. Already, she heard the shuffle of the other students getting up, and she slowly followed by their example. Neville nearly dropped his new plant when he stood up. "Well, here we are," he said. Resigned. Hermione and Neville walked out of the compartment and soon the Hogwarts Express together, Neville clutching his plant tightly so as to not nearly drop it again. There was the usual calling of the first years from Hagrid, the gamekeeper. Nobody knew why Professor Dumbledore kept him there to work at Hogwarts. Timid, short children who were much smaller than Hermione remembered being at their age walked over to him between their interested glances at the castle. "Ooh, I think I see him." Neville gawked when they stepped off the train. Hermione had been looking down at her feet. She glanced up at Neville, then to where his wide eyes were gazing. There was the back of a head with a mass of untidy hair just a few meters ahead of them. Other people were staring at the person, too. She sighed. "Neville, can you please not?" Hermione pleaded under her breath. She crossed her arms over her chest and tried to keep up with his suddenly fast pace. "I just wanted to meet him," he said. "Hey, do you think he'll like this?" Neville gestured to the plant set in his arms that were shaking under its weight by now. "Neville, please," Hermione said, sighing. She crossed her arms in front of her chest, since that was the only real protection she could offer herself, and followed her friend to the carriages. They were pulling themselves, as always. He climbed in after Neville and sat down across from him. Hermione leaned against the dusty interior and her eyelids shut of their own accord. She needed some sleep, although she knew she wouldn't be in a calming slumber for a while. The rickety motion of the carriage momentarily shook her awake, but even that wouldn't do. "You look tired," Neville noted. Hermione had never told Neville about her self-induced sleeping problem. It was too cowardly to admit. And besides, he'd go off and tell one of the professors, who would tell her parents. Nobody except for herself needed grief over this. "I'm fine," she replied, staring out the window and forcing her eyes to remain open as Neville searched her face for signs of sleepiness. "Honestly, Neville, I'm fine," she added, shooting him a look. He then turned away wordlessly. Time seemed to have sped up, because before she knew it, the carriages stopped in front of Hogwarts. She followed Neville, who had decided to not speak to her, and glanced up at the castle. The castle itself was truly beautiful. If only what happened within its walls wasn't so ugly. She did love magic, though. That was what made her keep walking to the grand doors amongst the other students. It kept her tied to this magical world. There was more to explore than the Muggle world could ever offer for her. Her curiosity and thirst to learn more about magic and his. Tori had a strong hold on her and made her wake up for classes every morning. Hermione might have not belonged at Hogwarts in the social aspect, but she still thrived to pay attention to intricate details of every lesson she attended and soak in the knowledge that she could. The grand doors opened and Hermione's heart dropped and her stomach twisted itself out of existence. In less than an hour's time, there would be a meal waiting for her, but she found that she'd lost her appetite. She mutely followed Neville down the endless corridor. There was a bustle of students crowding around her and eventually they made it to the Great Hall. The ceiling was beautifully enchanted, as always, to appear as the sky. That was one of the things she loved about the castle and its magic. There were first years already lined up to be sorted. Nervously looking around at the upperclassmen, Professor Dumbledore looked over the heads of the students entering the Great Hall. He didn't look as welcoming as he usually did. The staff table had its usual occupants, but there was one exception, a new teacher. The first thing Hermione thought of was a toad. She had a small black bow on the top of her head and she wore a pink cardigan. The girls around Hermione immediately began to comment on the woman's attire and proclaim that they wouldn't be caught dead wearing that. She was smiling at the students, but here was something about her smile that seemed off. She didn't actually seem happy. "Who's that?" Neville asked her, clearly noticing the woman's presence as well. She shrugged. "Probably the new defense teacher." Hermione looked around at the other students. Their whispers turned from the topic of Harry Potter to the new teacher, but it was only temporary, and soon they returned to their assumptions of the boy who lived. After all, every year they had a new defense against the dark arts teacher. It wasn't anything surprising. If anything, it was disappointing, because Hermione rather liked Professor Moody. He was a bit off his rocker, but when had they ever had a normal defense teacher? Hermione walked with the other Gryffindors past the rest of the house tables. She and Neville took their usual seats at the end, away from everyone else. Some students walking past her could only spare a quick glare before staring at Harry Potter, who was at the other end of the table. There were the usual snickers. But they weren't as bad as Harry had taken most of their attention. He might have not seemed like the most respectable person, but was a good diversion. It was ridiculous, really, that he had to rely on a diversion to keep her spirits up. "Ooh, he's in Gryffindor," Neville said to her, pointing at Harry. "I thought he'd be sorted along with the first years. The sorting hat is HT on the express to sort new students who are not going to be first years," Hermione informed him, practically remembering word for word a passage from Hogwarts, a history. "Oh," he said. "Well, he'll be in the same dormitory as me." Hermione smacked Neville's arm. She was perhaps one of the only people in the room who was not completely fascinated by him. It felt surreal to be back to the place she dreaded just because of the people here. But the snickers and insults and shoves were not ignorable. Hermione focused her gaze on the table in front of her, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The sorting began only too soon. Professor McGonagall called up the first years in alphabetical order. The hat shouted the names of the houses rhythmically and students clapped. Neville elbowed Hermione, and she snapped her head in his direction, mouthing, "What?" He jerked his head down the length of the Gryffindor table. Harry Potter had buried his face in his hands and his fingers clutched what they could of his hair. "He's been like that for the whole sorting," Neville whispered as the sorting hat shouted, "Ravenclaw." And students at that table clapped and cheered. Hermione looked away from Harry. Sure, it was odd. But was it any of her business? "Maybe you were right, maybe he is off," Neville thought aloud. He shrugged. When the sorting was over, Hermione looked over to the staff table at Professor Dumbledore. His eyes scanned the sea of students before him before he stood. He still hadn't looked any happier than he had when she'd first entered the room. "What happened?" "Welcome," he began in his deep, calm voice. "Pausing as usual, to Hogwarts for another year. I hope you're all well and had a great holiday." His eyes went over to Harry, who was entangling his hands from his fac. And giving Professor Dumbledore his attention. Most of the students had stopped their usual chatter to look up at the headmaster and listen. He pursed his lips and continued. "Before you fill your famished stomachs, I'd like to introduce you all to a new addition to the staff. Very new, in fact. She was appointed just yesterday. So it's especially important that we welcome her here and become her friend." "Oh, we will," one of the Weasley twins remarked from the other side of the table. A few people laughed. Professor Dumbledore cleared his throat and gestured to the woman at the staff table. "Dolores Umbridge will be your new defense against the dark arts teacher," he announced to the hall. There were a few short beats of silence, and then everyone joined into a weak applause, the false attempts echoing against the room's walls almost laughable. Professor Umbridge waved to them, like they were all her best friends in the entire world, and smiled widely, making her look very toad-like. Neville shivered. "She creeps me out. ... Harry didn't realize how late it was until Ron began to snore. He'd just been lying there, on his new 4-poster bed that was more comfortable and the guest bed at Grimmauld Place and certainly an improvement from the cupboard. But no matter how comfortable the mattress was, he couldn't will himself to go to sleep. The day had been so full of distractions that he'd basically been too busy to spend too much time worrying about fighting off nightmares. But his worries hadn't been at bay for too long. Before he knew it, here he was, in a boys' dormitory. Still awake amongst the students who could have peaceful slumber. Tomorrow was going to be the first real day of school. Real classrooms, real teachers, real lessons. He was supposed to Avenue another schedule dedicated to tutoring. How fun. The school was massive, and much different from what he'd expected. He might have actually enjoyed the decorations and talking portraits, he monologued. To stay as far away as possible from portraits in the corridors and avoid their conversations, if he'd been comfortable with magic. But all of it just seemed out to get him, out on a quest to make him as uncomfortable as possible. Harry was thankful for the fact that not much magic was performed that day, although he wasn't going to expect the same thing for tomorrow. There were classes to teach him about magic. No doubt that magic was going to be performed. The thought shook him. Ron had an idea of Harry's feelings around magic, but he really didn't understand the whole picture. Nobody could understand. Was Ron even his friend at this point? Maybe they were just stuck together, the two of them who knew the truth of what really happened versus the rest of the disbelieving school body. Perhaps Harry couldn't escape it. If he wanted to. But what was a friend? Harry had had his gang members, but were they friends? Before the graveyard, before knowing about magic or Voldemort, he thought he had friends, but now he knew that those people weren't friends. Sure, they'd talk about girls and sports and sex and games, and they'd make fun of other kids, but he couldn't completely trust them. Harry only found himself trusting Sirius. He supposed Sirius was his only friend, and the man must have been 20 years older than he. But it was something. For a moment he thought of writing to Sirius and go to the Ollery, a place where he could mail out the letter to, according to Ron, but then he remembered, he didn't know where the Ollery was. And it was pretty wimpy to go and ask Ron where it was. Asking for directions was stupid. And, in fact, it was pretty wimpy to even write to Sirius if he'd been separated from him for just less than 24 hours. He was weak enough. Rice smacked himself on the side of his head to keep him awake. There was no way he was falling asleep, only to then wake up screaming like some sort of pansy on the first day of school. He'd man up and keep himself awake. Was there really another option? It had been exactly 4 hours since Neville had said, "Good night," to her, a little bitterly because she'd been reprimanding him for OGL-ing over Harry Potter, and she'd simply nodded back with a stiff smile. It wasn't the best start to the year when it came to her friendship with Neville, but she did have to admit that the attention was focused away from her. She supposed that one day, maybe at a class reunion, if wizards had things like that, she would thank Harry Potter for the distraction. But she didn't find herself wishing to speak to him anytime soon. Hermione sighed and crossed her legs on the couch she was sitting on. She'd been holding a book in her lap. The words lost their meaning about an hour ago, and now all the words jumbled up into incoherent phrases so that she'd long given up on trying to decipher their meaning. Her tiredness caused her eyelids to droop and obscure her vision, and she shook her head. Her parents were probably asleep by now. They always feel asleep early, leaving their daughter awake and alone. Perhaps the girls in the dormitories were asleep as well. Or maybe they were still awake, giggling about whatever normal girls giggled about, probably Harry Potter. There were constant stares pointed at him by female students, and not just because he was famous. Stupid girls and their stuff. It giggling and Harry Potter's stupid phenotypes. It was all so bloody stupid. Hermione ran her fingers through her hair distractedly. She'd been using a serum her mother had given her, and it had been working to tame her hair so it fell in loose curls, and while she thought that she'd stop using it at the start of school, she found that she liked her hair much more this way. Sure, she wasn't a supermodel now. And yes, there was still some frizz that just couldn't ever be managed, but it was something she could deal with, even if she still wasn't pretty like the other girls at school. She opened the book in her lap once again with one last hope that she'd be able to read it, but her tired eyes just wouldn't cooperate. The text could have been in another language and she wouldn't have known it. Her head sagged forward, her body intent on getting some sleep. The exhaustion she felt reached every cell in her body. The urge to sleep peacefully was overwhelming. Hermione wondered if she was the only student at Hogwarts up this late. Maybe there were people like her as well, forcing themselves to stay awake in order to fight their fears. Or maybe she was alone. It all started in defense against the dark arts class. Since it was the first day of classes, it was the only class that was scheduled for that day. Professor Umbridge had been looking very toad-like, walking around the room and making sure that the classroom was quiet as everyone read the ministry-approved textbook. The students seemed bummed out at the fact that there wasn't a practical lesson. There was no magic being performed in the class, which Harry didn't personally mind, but it seemed kind of silly to be learning just from reading it. The other students who weren't afraid of magic certainly weren't going to learn anything from this. It was almost laughable. Ron, who was sitting next to him, elbowed him in the ribs. Harry gratefully tore his gaze from the stupid textbook and turned to face him, mouthing, "What?" Ron jutted his head and Harry's eyes followed his direction until he saw a tiny single hand patiently in the air, its owner being Hermione Granger. Her big brown eyes were focused on Umbridge, who seemed to be intentionally avoiding her. Practically every other student in the room was looking at Hermione. "She's always bothering teachers, you know, nagging them with questions," Ron whispered to Harry. The room was awkwardly still until Umbridge said sweetly, "Yes, dear." Hermione looked around the room, aware for the first time of all the eyes on her. It looked almost as though she was going to say, "Never mind." But she cleared her throat and said, Professor, I don't see any mention in this book of actually using any spells. So I was just wondering." Umbridge's smile slackened. "Well, have you read the entire textbook?" Hermione's face turned red. Yes, Professor." Someone in the back of the room laughed, but she ignored it. "There's no need to use that tone with me," Umbridge said, the usual sweetness of her voice dripping away. "I'm sorry, Professor, I didn't mean to, Hermione stammered, but she was cut off. "Why would we need to actually use the spells, anyway?" the professor asked. "It's not like anyone would hurt you, you're all children. Nobody would hurt you." Harry couldn't help it, he laughed. This woman knew nothing. Umbridge, as well as the whole class, turned to him. Hermione let out a huge breath, as though thankful for the attention being turned on him. "Is there a problem here?" No, Professor, he said, shrugging. Ron smirked. It's just that I can't imagine that nobody would want to hurt us. Umbridge looked at him strangely. Maybe she knew exactly where he was going with this. What are you talking about, Mr. Potter? Before Harry could say anything back to her, before he could tell her just what he was talking about, the bell rang for classes to be dismissed. Harry let out a breath he hadn't known he'd been holding. He joined Ron and gratefully stood up without answering Umbridge, gathered his things, and turned to leave. I don't want any further interruptions in my class, please, Umbridge called sweetly to the backs of the leaving students. We'll pick up on reading the next time I see you. Harry and the other students left the classroom, chatting amongst each other about both Hermione's and Harry's interruptions of the class. Hermione was still at the door, probably waiting for that boy Harry had seen her with, and some of the kids were pointing at her and whispering. I can't believe you did that, Ron began proudly. But he was cut off by another voice. So, Mr. Potter, what are you talking about? The voice, clearly male, imitated Umbridge's high-pitched voice. Harry turned and saw a boy with light blonde hair and pale skin approach him. His thin face made an expression of clear intent, and his eyes were narrowing. Oh, fuck off, Ron said. Clearly, this boy was not favorable. His Chul robes had the Slytherin crest emblazoned upon it. Ah, that was why. No, I want to know what Potter here was going on about, the boy went on. He was a couple of feet away from Harry now. Well, if you must know, Harry began, balling his fists and prepared to give a speech right then and there, but Ron interrupted. Malfoy, honestly, fuck off. Malfoy. Harry remembered that name. Malfoy was the name of one of the Death Eaters. Lucius, was it? Voldemort had called him over. The man had laughed at Harry's pain. He must have been this boy's father. A chill ran down Harry's spine. Without thinking, he launched himself at this boy named Malfoy and threw his fists right at the bastard's face. Harry! Ron screamed after him, but he didn't actually make any move to stop him. There were a few screams following Ron's. Some cheering for Malfoy, some cheering for Harry, but Harry didn't even care about that anymore. All he wanted to do was punch this kid into next week. His father was a follower of Voldemort. No doubt that the boy followed the same mindset. On and on his fist went, hitting any part of the boy that he could reach and inflicting as much pain as possible. Malfoy tried to fight back with weak punches, even tried to reach for his wand, but his attempts were futile, for Harry's anger was overtaking the entire fight. He didn't feel like he could stop even if he wanted to. He could easily pound this kid's face for eternity and still not be satisfied. Potter! One voice shouted above all the others, and the screams and cheers stopped. Clearly a teacher. A force suddenly forced the two apart. And Harry was thrown in one direction and Malfoy in the opposite. Professor McGonagall stood between the two panting students with her wand held high. Come with me, Potter, she said stiffly. As Harry slowly got to his feet she turned to Malfoy and said, I'll be writing to Professor Snape. The crowd of students thinned and Ron gave him a weak pat on the back before leaving with the other Gryffindors. Neville, stop staring, a small, somehow familiar voice scolded, but Harry didn't even bother to see who it was as he went on to follow the professor. Neville, stop staring, Hermione scolded as Harry walked past. Sorry, he mumbled. But did you see that? Yes, she said quietly. Malfoy did deserve a punch in the face, but the way Harry just jumped at him like that, out of seemingly nowhere, proved her point even more. He was off. She didn't want Neville to be involved with kids like that. The boy was already impressionable. It wasn't going to do him any good if he hung out with Harry. Oh God, I left my wand in the classroom. Neville squeaked, reaching around in his robes. It must have fallen out of my pocket. Hermione sighed. When didn't he forget something? He was her friend. And yes, she was there for him, but the poor boy was just downright helpless when it came to trying to remember things. Go back and ask Umbridge to help you. I'll meet you in the Great Hall for dinner. All right, she said. Once he nodded, his round face anxious, she took off towards the hall, leaving in the same direction Professor McGonagall and Harry left moments before. She was starving. The halls were awfully quiet except for the sound of footsteps past her, perhaps a length of a corridor behind. At first she wasn't bothered by it, because it was just simple chatter. But then she began to decipher what those words really meant when the voices grew louder. Hey, Granger. One voice mocked. Her heart sank and she picked up her pace. Just look down, she thought to herself. Look down and just get to the Great Hall. Hermione clutched her books to her chest, even though it was useless, really, as a shield. It wasn't even comforting. Nothing was comforting at this point. Oi, it continued. Another voice, at a higher pitch, shouted, why isn't she turning around? We just want to have a chat, don't we, girls? There was a loud and obnoxious murmur of agreement that sent a chill down Hermione's spine. No, these girls did not just want to have a chat. She knew the voices and the mocking too well. She lived with it 7 days a week. How could she be so stupid to assume that Harry Potter's fame would be a distraction? If anything, it was only temporary and expired after 24 hours. Nobody, no matter how famous they were, could shield her now. Hermione was out in the open. Vulnerable, again. Hermione. One shrieked. What an ugly name, someone added, and they all laughed. Their footsteps were getting louder. Were they running? Hermie. One didn't know what their plan of attack was, but she did not want to stay in the middle of a corridor and find out. The laughter was being amplified every second and their sound broke a barrier at one point. And she was sure they nearly in the same corridor as her. She felt like prey, seeking a way to escape the predators, who were baring their teeth and ready to pounce. Hermione's heart raced a million beats a second, almost to the point where it was louder than the laughter behind her, and her brain searched. She needed to find somewhere to hide. Anywhere away from here. Hermione was smart, but in panicked situations even her intelligence hid from the laughing girls behind her. There was a door, right down the hallway, just a few meters away. The whole corridor could have gone dark, and a light could have shone upon that door, in all its glory. It looked vaguely familiar, like she'd visited the room behind it once, but that didn't matter anymore. The voices were growing louder and she was running out of time. Hermione darted and clutched her books so that they wouldn't fall. Some of her hair whipped into her face and her heart was urging her on, pumping blood at a rate that was surely unhealthy at this point. Her hearing sharpened in her panic and she could hear the cackling girls again. She could escape this, she could get out of this. Her hand grabbed the doorknob and she swung the door open, blindly walked in. And closed it behind her. Only when she turned around did she realize the room was already occupied. Professor McGonagall and Harry Potter were sitting in McGonagall's office, staring at her. She couldn't really blame them. So Hermione did the first thing that came to her mind, apologized. Oh, I'm sorry, Professor, she said breathlessly. Her chest rose and fell with her ragged breaths from running down the corridor. Her shaky hand clutched the doorknob, just in case the professor was going to shoo her out and demand that she left at once. While Professor McGonagall, pursed lips and all, and that was never a good sign, contemplated for a few seconds on how to approach her unexpected visitor, Harry stared at Hermione. He'd been sitting across from the professor and he twisted his body around to see her. He just sat there, wordlessly looking at her. His eyes were so green, how had she not noticed that before? Miss Granger, may I ask that you knock first before entering my office? Professor McGonagall uttered. Hermione sighed and leaned against the back of the door that separated her from the laughing girls. I'll keep that in mind, Professor. What is it that you needed to speak to me with that couldn't wait? Her mind stumbled for excuses, homework assignments. No, she didn't have transfiguration class. Scheduling. No, she already worked that out. I didn't mean to walk in, Professor, I thought this was another room. Professor McGonagall's eyes searched Hermione's face, as though trying to see past her lies, and Hermione was almost certain that Professor McGonagall in particular had that sort of power, but she said nothing more on the topic. It was old news. Right, then, Miss Granger, you've reminded me there is one thing I'd like to talk to you about. Potter, will you step outside, please? Harry tore his eyes away from Hermione. She let out a breath she'd been holding, and turned to face the professor. Sure, he said quietly. Then he did just McGonagall had asked. Hermione was surprised, from what she'd seen just moments ago, with his rage being pounded into Draco Malfoy, she was shocked to see the boy obeying any sort of orders. When the door closed behind him, the professor faced Hermione and gestured for her to sit. Hermione nervously took Harry's old seat. She didn't know what McGonagall had in store for her. But she was almost sure that it wasn't going to be anything positive. She kept holding her books in front of her chest for protection, her only shield. As you know, Miss Granger, Potter is new to the school. And so he needs a tour of the school, and perhaps just some mentoring with a student who has been here for a long time. Oh no. Hermione squeezed her pile of books tightly. And, while you're here, I think that you'd be suitable for the job, McGonagall informed her. Professor, thank you for the offer, but, of course, it would look good on your academic record. The professor interrupted with a raised eyebrow, egging her on. Volunteer work like that, especially when the name Potter is thrown around a bit, could be of good use to you. Hermione didn't deny the offer this time. It was going to be good for her academic record, and that, above all, was what she was putting her blood, sweat, and tears into. She wanted to get out of Hogwarts by the end of her 7th year knowing that all of her suffering was worth it. She knew that Professor McGonagall might have been using some leverage, knowing how dedicated Hermione was, but honestly, what other motive was there for her to go through with this? Because Harry Potter was just such a charming, polite boy. Professor McGonagall took Hermione's silence as a yes. While on your normal duty for patrols as a prefect, Potter will be tagging along with you. I want you to welcome him to the school and show him where everything is. I'll clear the arrangements up with Mr. Filch so that he does not punish Potter for being out past curfew. It seems that, outside of his normal classes and tutoring with professors, nighttime is the only time left for extra help for Potter. Hermione nodded, soaking all of it in. So she'd spend her nighttime patrols with Harry. It wasn't as though she was going to be missing out on sleep. She would have been keeping herself awake either way, and now she had something to do. Although, at the same time, Harry seemed a bit dangerous. He was certainly off, and his sudden attack on Malfoy proved Hermione's theory. Somehow, something had happened in his life and made him the way he was. And it worried Hermione for her own safety's sake. She didn't want to get too involved with him. They'd just stay acquaintances, nothing more. It was all just for her academic record, which she valued above Harry. Professor, may I ask you a question? Of course. Why, did Harry start punching Draco Malfoy like that? I mean, there has to be some sort of explanation behind it. I think that that's something he should tell you in person, if he wishes. I don't think I'm fit to give you the details, Professor McGonagall said. Right. I'm sorry. Hermione FTED in her seat uncomfortably and took to staring at the floor. It's quite all right. Although, she added somberly, there is something that I think you should be informed on about Potter. Hermione paused and looked up at McGonagall. Her tone had become much lower and she wondered what she was going to tell Hermione. Professor McGonagall took a breath, looked right at Hermione, and said, Potter is a little nervous around magic. He was introduced to it in a way we didn't want him to be. I'd just like to warn you to not conjure any sudden magic around him. His reaction to it is not something I'd like you to be exposed to. Hermione's mind raced for reasoning behind this, but she did not dare to ask why Harry was that way. She supposed it would be some hidden secret, kept from her anxious ears. Just between Harry and the people he trusted. It seemed unlike him to trust anyone, but maybe he had no choice. Okay, Hermione stammered out. Now that that's all settled, Professor McGonagall. Elle pulled out her wand and conjured a matching seat beside Hermione's. Get Potter, will you? She nodded, stood up, and opened the door. Harry's arms were crossed and he was looking down the length of the corridor. He was unaware of Hermione's presence there. It seemed so odd to see him so calm after he'd brutally went after Draco Malfoy without any sort of clear explanation. The anger that had been building up inside of him scared her. She coughed quietly, not knowing how else to get his attention, and when he snapped out of his trance to look at her she took a step backwards. God, he was off. He faced her and waited expectantly. Well, he asked. She took another step backwards. Professor McGonagall wants to talk to both of us, Hermione said softly from the doorway, lamely gesturing behind her. What did she talk to you about? He asked, not moving. You'll find out. Hermione didn't want to break the news to him that he was going to be stuck with her during her nighttime patrols. She didn't know just how violent he was. But he surprised her again and shrugged at her response, and they wordlessly walked back into the office together. A part of Hermione thought that Harry wasn't going to show up. He did not seem like someone who would obey orders like being stuck with the ugliest, most unpopular girl at school every night. There was something off about him, although Hermione couldn't pinpoint it exactly, that made her scared. She thought about the wand that was tucked away in her robes, and even practiced ways to retrieve it as quickly as possible. She'd seen what he did to Malfoy, didn't want to become his next victim. Maybe this was part of his punishment for beating up Draco Malfoy like that. That's all she was to him, a form of punishment. And that was perfectly fine with her. The less involved she was with him, the better. It was for the best. But there he was. Harry showed up. He was 10 minutes late, but Hermione was too scared to ridicule him for his tardiness. He had changed out of his school robes and into Muggle clothing. Hermione had taken to wearing Muggle clothes, a long-sleeve shirt and jeans, as well, which she was more comfortable with. She kept her attire loose-fitting because while this was just a tour of the school, Harry was still a teenage boy, and getting attention from boys in that unspoken way was not something that her virginal mind could handle. She only dared to wear Muggle attire when the rest of the school was asleep, because her status as a Muggleborn did not help her relationship with the Slytherins. For one crazy moment she thought that Harry was going to say something as his eyes flicked down her body, but he immediately looked back up at her face and she shook the thought away. "Should we go then?" He spoke up first, putting his hands in his pockets. Why yeah," she said. She pushed a piece of hair behind her right ear and motioned for him to follow. "I'll start by showing you different routes to the Gryffindor Tower, I guess. Since that's where you'll be spending a lot of time." Harry just shrugged, even though she couldn't see because her eyes weren't looking in his direction. In fact, it looked like she was purposely avoiding his gaze. It didn't take a genius to figure out that she didn't have many friends, and probably didn't know how to act around him. It was a little irritating that he probably wouldn't be able to hold a regular conversation. Harry was already frustrated from the day's events and didn't need this. But he held it in and shut his fucking mouth and just went with it. About a few minutes into walking in silence, Hermione finally spoke. "You'll probably go through this route the most because it stems right from the Great Hall, so you can go here after meals. It's by this portrait." She pointed over to a portrait of a man who was sitting in a chair, waving at the two. Neither of them waved back. "Okay," he said. "Although," she continued, turning to face her beau. Die towards him but not actually looking at him, "you'll probably have Ron with you after meals to lead you there anyway. This is just in case you're, without him, or something. And it's just good to, know these things." Harry might have not been the smartest kid around, but even he noticed the way her tone changed when she mentioned Ron. He still hadn't forgotten her encounter with him on the train. Harry had just sat there awkwardly, letting the events unfold, but what else was he supposed to do? "You hate Ron," he blurted out. Hermione took a breath and actually looked at him this time. Her big brown eyes staring straight at him. "Hate is a strong word." "Okay, you just don't like him," he corrected. His sentence hung in the air and he wondered if he should have told her that he noticed how Ron treats her. But maybe that wasn't the appropriate thing to say. What the hell was proper etiquette? Was he even supposed to use etiquette with someone like her? Hermione could only shrug at this. She clearly wasn't much of a talker. She folded her arms across her small chest and continued walking, facing the floor. "Go up these stairs and it'll take you straight to Gryffindor Tower," she said a few minutes later, pointing at a staircase. "But don't the staircases move?" He couldn't help but ask. He made a mental note to thank Ron profusely for guiding him through the school for the day. Otherwise, he would have been completely lost. Although, really, figuring out the layout of the castle was the least of his problems. "Then you take whatever route you can to get to that corridor," she replied, keeping her gaze away from him. "It'll lead you to the fat lady." Hermione's voice was so quiet that Harry could barely hear her. Hermione, being afraid of him, almost stopped being a possibility by now. There was no doubt that she kept her distance from him out of fear. He still couldn't forget the way she looked at him when he emerged from his fight with Malfoy, a mixture of fear and disgust. And she wasn't alone in fearing him. After he'd lunged himself at Malfoy with malicious intent, he realized that everyone would assume they'd be his next victim. If only they knew what was really behind it. And, I mean, people sometimes freeze the staircase temporarily, so long as Filch isn't around. It's not technically breaking the rules, but he gets all sensitive around magic, Rye's breath hitched at her words and she paused and looked up at him. Sorry. So she must have known. It was no wonder, McGonagall must have warned her about how Harry would react to seeing magic. He somehow felt violated, knowing that a completely stranger was aware of his sensitivity to magic while he was attending a school of magic. It seemed like the thing that he would tell her after warming up to her. Although with the way things were going, they weren't going to be anything more than classmates. So McGonagall told you, he said with a sigh. Hermione shrugged. Her eyes flickered back to the floor. Well, she just said to be careful. No details, don't worry. I don't know why you're like that. Then she added, in a quieter voice, I don't want to know. Harry almost wanted to tell her not to tell anyone, although he doubted that she had many people to tell anything to. You're right, he said, and she looked up at him, her large eyes filled with curiosity. You don't want to know. Her little body seemed to tremble at his words. Of course she was probably thinking of possibilities, but nothing could be as excruciating as the truth. If she was that afraid just thinking about it, her hair would turn gray if she knew the truth. She inhaled deeply and gestured for them to keep moving. If anything, he had just made her more afraid of him. Although whether or no, she was afraid of him did not really affect him. It made no difference, she was just a bloody mentor or whatever, for Christ's sake. The two remained silent for the next 20 minutes or so, except for when Hermione pointed out different classrooms and certain routes to them. Harry had to admit that she knew what the hell she was doing. Harry, can I ask you a question? Hermione asked out of the blue. She looked up at him. Lights from overhead reflected in her brown eyes, making her looking even more doe-eyed than usual. He found himself saying, yeah, sure. Sorry for asking, but it's been bothering me. Kind of. She paused. Why did you go after Draco Malfoy like that? I mean, why you don't have to answer, if you don't want to. That's okay, I mean, you do. Have to answer that, I'm sorry for asking. Harry was caught off guard. He certainly hadn't expected her to just put that question out there. It had remained unspoken between them until now. He almost wanted to retaliate with asking her why she burst into McGonagall's office as though she was running from something, but he bit his tongue. I don't like him very much, was his simple answer. Quote, Is that what you do to all people you don't like? She asked softly. Harry sighed. No. What, do you think I'm some kind of raging maniac? That I just go after anyone I don't like? He hadn't meant for his words to sound so harsh. But once they escaped his lips there was no taking it back. Hermione took several steps away from him. It looked like she was about to cry. I don't think you're a raging maniac, she said shakily. Then what do you think I am? Hermione had backed up into the opposite wall at this point. Her thin frame leaned against it, taking in all the support it would provide her with. She was looking at everything else but him, and then it seemed like she had an answer prepared. It doesn't matter, she said, shrugging. What? It doesn't matter to you what I think, she said more clearly and loudly. Harry had nothing to say to this. Ron had been right about her at least in one sense, Hermione was way too smart. Harry felt transparent near her, like she could understand his every secret and thought. But in other ways, Ron was misguided. His comments on her appearance didn't make any sense to Harry. In fact, Harry had taken off his glasses during lunch and kept cleaning them because he thought he was seeing someone different than who Ron was seeing. In Ron's opinion, Hermione was the ugliest girl in the school. Harry hadn't seen all the girls in the school, but so far, Hermione was one of the prettiest. She probably didn't even know how pretty she was. It was that kind of effortless beauty that didn't need any mascara or eyeliner or whatever all of that makeup crap was. And, okay, she kind of had a nice body. It kind of sucked, really. If she'd been more outgoing and more suggestive, like the other girls in their year, Harry might have even considered hooking up with her. But everything she was doing so far was a turn-off. A small part of Harry could almost understand what Ron meant. She made that pretty face unattractive with the way she was so awkwardly introverted. After a while, beyond the explanations of different corridors and where classes were, Hermione looked down at her watch and gasped. "Oh my, it's late," she said quietly. She looked over at Harry. "We should probably head back. You're probably tired." It was true, he was tired. But falling asleep was certainly not one of his plans. "I'm fine," he found himself saying. "I don't really sleep that much." "Do you have health issues that makes you that way?" was her immediate question. It sounded almost too nurturing, so much that Harry wanted to pull away from her. "No, it's nothing like that. I kind of choose to stay awake." Hermione nodded, but it actually seemed genuine. Like she knew what he meant beyond his words. This girl really was too smart. She looked up at him and searched his face with her gaze. "I know what you mean," she finally said with a sigh. Those dark circles under her eyes seemed more ghastly paired with her sigh of exhaustion. "I never get any sleep, either." "School work?" Harry asked. He could only assume that this girl's lack of sleep was due to her dedication to school. Harry never personally understood why people would get so stressed over getting schoolwork done. It was a waste, really. And, honestly, he had more things to worry about, things that kept him wide awake at late hours of the night and far into the morning. Hermione shrugged. "Just a mixture of things, I suppose," she told him. They continued to walk. To where, Harry wasn't sure, but he found that he didn't really care. It seemed like he was not the only one staying awake. Sometimes it's just easier to stay awake, you know. Even though the side effects are awful, it's like I'm in control. It sounds silly, doesn't it? I think it made more sense just in my head. No, I get it. Harry said truthfully. He understood completely. It was an interesting insight that she gave. Staying awake did give him more control. Maybe the two of them were more alike than he'd initially thought. Who would have known? "Why do you stay awake?" she asked, turning to face him, her eyes meeting his. Hermione almost seemed nervous to ask this question. She was so goddamn timid, like a freaking deer. Or whatever the hell was scared of every bloody thing. "Well, it's like you said, to stay in control," he said. "It's easier this way, to stay awake." Hermione looked at him like she was going to press him with another question, but she refrained from interrogating him. He knew that his response was vague, but in his defense, so was hers. It seemed like the other didn't want to admit their real reason as to why they stayed awake. Harry wasn't ready to tell this stranger, or acquaintance, if anything, about Voldemort, about the nightmares that he had to go through, the memories he'd relive. If he dared to fall asleep. But even if this girl wasn't going to admit why she stayed awake, even if they never really became friends, even if they ever stopped these tours around the school. One thing was certain, Harry was not alone. Ron had already told Harry all about Professor Snape, and how Harry shouldn't smirk or show any sign of happiness because Snape would wipe it right off his face. But seeing Draco Malfoy with a black eye was hard to not smirk at. That boy was related to someone who'd watched Harry be mercilessly tortured. In fact, Malfoy probably knew about the graveyard all along. Harry could find no sympathy for him whatsoever. He'd received weird and frightened looks from classmates all around him, but he'd already been used to that from his old school. He beats someone up. Everyone freaks out. Nobody approaches him. Nothing new. Okay, I don't think I can keep a straight face when Malfoy's beaten-up face is in sight, Ron whispered to Harry. Harry nodded and let out a small smile. After all, the dreaded professor wasn't there yet. May as well get the happiness out of system while he could. The room was filled with funny-smelling foams that made Harry instinctively assume they were all poisonous. Maybe they actually were. He tried to keep his distance from whatever the source might have been, but it seemed that the smells were everywhere, engulfing him. He coughed a few times, but he was the only one. Everyone else was used to this. Hermione looked over at him when he coughed. She had that same nurturing expression that made him want to cower away from her. What did she think? That he was going to die? It was just a little cough. She quickly looked away when their eyes met. Harry had not told Ron about the nighttime tours. And he assumed that Hermione had not told Neville, because that dorky pet of hers wasn't acting any differently. Good. It was better that way. Their tour together had ended at some ungodly hour, but neither of them seemed bothered. It wasn't like they were getting any sleep anyway. The fact that someone else out there stayed up as well somehow comforted Harry. Stop the chit-chat, a voice said from God knew where. It was low and sent a chill down his spine. A still silence hit the room and none of the students said a word. Harry looked around. The other students had taken to doing that as well, and saw someone wearing long black robes emerge from the front of the room. It was the same man he'd seen at the staff table that Ron had identified as Snape. He really did need to wash his hair or something. Harry wanted to take a shower just by looking at him. The man's gaze swept the room as his footsteps pounded against the cold floor. It was that kind of challenging stare that Harry's old headmaster had. And it was still just as freaky. When Snape's eyes met Harry's, there was an obvious prejudice there, but Harry acted as though nothing had happened. I see you've all probably forgo most of the material over the holiday. Which is a shame, because your OWLs are at the end of the school year and some of you may not be seeing me next year. Really, what a pity. Snape turned to face the class full on. Partially concealed by the shadows the eerie room cast upon him. I see we have a new student, he said loudly. Nearly everyone in the room looked over at Harry. But really, people staring at him was nothing new. Potter, what do the OWLs stand for? What the hell? Harry saw Hermione's hand shoot up into the air, but he highly doubted that Snape was going to call on her. He tried to remember what Dumbledore had told him, but he was drawing a blank. No idea, Harry said with a shrug. So what? He didn't know an answer. Oh well. That was the story of his life in his Muggle school. Snape murmured. Are you sure you should even be in this course, if you don't even know the name of the most important test you'll ever take is? Clearly, Snape's question was rhetorical. It was followed by a tense silence. Harry was pissed, of course, but he didn't let it show. He kept his face relaxed and his mouth shut. In the corner of his eye, he saw Hermione's hand lower back to her side, defeated. Snape then looked away from Harry and pierced his gaze into some other victims before beginning to talk about the harshness of the OWLs, which, Snape gladly said Street. Ood for ordinary wizarding level examinations, but Potter wouldn't have known that, and his speech in its entirety was basically one huge threat. Every time he asked a question, Hermione raised her hand, but she was ignored. Sometimes Snape would point out the answer to Harry because he, obviously doesn't know what's going on, and, should study more if he wants his teachers to take him seriously. Harry already planned what he was going to say in a letter to Sirius. Thinking about being able to tell someone about all of us somewhat calmed him down, and so by the end of the period, he just wanted to punch Snape in the face rather than full out kill him. It was some sort of improvement. Ron tried to give out the answer when Harry was asked for it, but it seemed that even he knew just as as Harry did on the subject of potions. It didn't take a genius to figure out that Ron wasn't an A student by any means. When the class was dismissed, it seemed that every student let out a long breath that they'd all been collectively holding during the longest hour of their lives. Harry knew that some teachers totally sucked, but this was bad. He wouldn't go running to Dumbledore like a wimp. Harry still had his dignity. And telling the headmaster would just give Snape satisfaction, but he was definitely going to send that letter to Sirius. He's never been that bad, Ron said as they left the potions room. They could finally breathe clean air as opposed to the fumes surrounding them in that goddamned classroom. Sorry, mate. A couple of Ron's other friends, Dean and Seamus, walked up to Harry and told them that Snape was a dick as well, which kind of helped knowing that they were all in one mindset, all of them versus Snape. They also congratulated Harry for beating Malfoy up the day before. Malfoy didn't dare to make a comment to Harry, and he and the two monkeys trailing him walked quickly past him, Malfoy barking orders at them. So, do you want to go play wizard chess? Ron asked once Dean and Seamus left. I can teach you. It's a really cool game, you know. Can't, sorry, I have a tutoring session with McGonagall, Harry said, shrugging. At least this session wasn't with Snape. He couldn't complain. Oh, well, good luck. She can't be as bad as Snape. And with a pat on the back, Ron left. Harry hesitated before going down the opposite corridor. He had asked Hermione how to get to McGonagall's room from the potions room the night before, and he was glad he did, because this whole dungeons area was fucking confusing. He turned down the correct corridors, because all of this seemed familiar. And eventually he made it to the classroom. He opened the wooden door in front of it and saw McGonagall standing near a mass of a random assortment of pillows. She was holding a box of something. And Harry didn't want to ask what was inside of it. Maybe he had come at a wrong time, she clearly hadn't cleaned up from whatever the hell she was doing beforehand. "Hello, Potter," she said. As though the setup of the room wasn't odd or anything. "Glad to see you've made it here. I'm guessing you asked Miss Granger directions during your tour with her." Yeah." He took a few careful steps forward. "And how was the tour overall?" "It was fine," Harry said with a shrug. Was all McGonagall said further on the matter, and then she sighed. "Now, I have to say you're calmer than I thought you'd be, given the circumstances." Both of them knew that, the circumstances, was Harry having to deal with Snape. Harry just nodded. Professor, what is all of this stuff for?" He couldn't help but to ask. She looked as though she had been waiting for him to ask this question. "Well, as you know, I'm the Transfiguration teacher here. And to succeed in my class, you need to use a wand. Molly Weasley has notified me on the situation you have with Ollivander, that he has sent several wands. What I'm going to have you do is try out different wands and we'll see which one works the best." Harry had been frozen from the moment she said, "You need to use a wand." He suddenly knew what all of these pillows were for. They weren't random, they were meant for target practice. To see what he could do. To see what magic could do. Not even a desk or a board was in the room, so nothing could really hurt him. Even the windows were boarded up. He felt like as in one of those Muggle insane asylums, surrounded by tons of cushiony things with no dangerous object in sight. It was kind of embarrassing. "I don't think I'm ready for that," Harry told her truthfully. "Potter, tell me something," Professor McGonagall began, taking a step towards him. The box in her hands must have had all of the wands Ollivander sent over. He didn't know how she got the wands out of his trunk. And he didn't dare ask. "Wouldn't you like to learn how to defend yourself by use of magic? I think that you, out of all the students here, understand just what magic can do." I guess I would want to defend myself." She nodded. "We both know that you know who is out there. You are one of his main targets, and without a wand, you are completely vulnerable. How you escaped from him before, I'm not sure. But I think a lot of it had to do with luck and his underestimation of you. Next time, you may not be so lucky, Potter. He knows that you're in this school, learning about magic. Wouldn't it be a waste if the next time you and him met up, you knew just as little as you had the first time?" McGonagall looked down at the box in her hands and held a firmer grasp on it. When she glanced back up at him, her eyes were sharper than ever. "Prove to him that you can fight back, Potter. For us to say that he'll never come after you again is just a bandage over the wound, it's temporary comfort until he returns. Now I hate to be the one to bring you to this reality, but you need to realize that you have to at least try. See what you can do. You don't even have to perform a proper spell yet. Nobody is expecting you to be excellent at first, but if you can walk out of this classroom with a wand in your hand, then that in itself is an accomplishment." He didn't know what to say. Harry couldn't argue, really. Because she was saying all of the things that nobody else would say. And he admired that about her. He could try. McGonagall was right. Voldemort wasn't finished with Harry. He'd come back sooner or later, and Harry needed to be prepared. Harry nodded and swallowed hard. He wanted to get this over and done with. His nerves were already getting to him. The F.A. court that he was going to be holding a wand, something that could perform all sorts of magic, was keeping him on edge. McGonagall reached into the box and pulled out a simple, thin wand. Ollivander separated them by their power. He gave a few weaker wands just for you to get the feel of, but you shouldn't actually stick with any of them. Once again, he nodded. McGonagall walked over to him and put the wand in his hand. He held it as lightly as he could. This was dangerous. In fact, he would have been more comfortable holding a gun than this thing. He kept his arm extended, separating himself from the wand as much as possible. His hand was already shaking. "Calm down, Potter. You can't actually perform any dangerous spells if you don't know the incantations. And it won't turn on you. That's just impossible." "Everything's possible, Professor," Harry told her. When she looked over at him, he thought he was going to get yelled at, but instead her mouth just became less of a line and more of a smile. Harry couldn't stop looking at that killer in his hand. It reminded him of Voldemort's wand, the most dangerous weapon ever known to man. There was a thumping headache being brought back to the front of his mind. It was always there, the headache, that dull humming of pain, but he'd normally push it to the back of his mind. There was no physical pain in the rest of his body. Maybe it as some sort of game his mind was playing. He didn't even feel safe in his own head, which might have been one of the worst feelings ever. McGonagall cleared her throat and said, "Now, when you're ready, point the wand at any pillow." "What's going to happen?" "Well, normally, nothing happens, and we move on to the next wand. But usually there are sparks emitting from the tip of the wand, or the pillow shifts over." Imagining himself moving something, or doing anything, really, with magic, was a little scary. He looked at a pillow across from him, aimed, and closed his eyes. The silent seconds wore on, in rhythm with his pounding headache, but nothing happened. "I didn't expect anything more," the professor reassured him. He opened his eyes to see her shifting through the box and extracting. A different wand, more bent and awkwardly shaped. "This one might have a reaction. And what do I do if it does?" "Just keep a hold of it. You're in control, Potter, not the wand," McGonagall told him. "You have the magic. The wand just translates it. You were born with magic." That was an odd way to think of it. He shrugged and grasped the other wand she had given him. He still felt just as nervous as last time, even though he kept trying to tell himself that he was in control. It seemed like the headache was taking up most of the space in his head, and common sense had no room to fit in. Harry pointed at the same pillow, aimed, and closed his eyes once again. Nothing. He immediately handed the wand over to McGonagall, who wordlessly put it back and took another out. There were no words of encouragement this time, if he could call her speeches of harsh reality, encouragement, as he aimed again. He shut his eyes and there were a small feeling in his hand, and he lost it. He dropped the wand and staggered backwards, opening his eyes to look for any dangers. His breathing was heavy. McGonagall picked up the wand he had dropped and put it back in the box. She was acting as though he hadn't just wimped out. There were a few sparks. "We're making progress." "Progress?" Harry asked, raising an eyebrow. "You certainly acted better than I thought you would have. Here, let's have a go at the medium-powered ones." Harry wanted to protest, but before he knew it, another wand was in his hand and McGonagall was saying things like, "You're in control," and, "Don't worry if you feel anything, that's supposed to happen." He aimed and this time, he kept his eyes open. There was a warmth in his hand and sparks, like miniature fireworks, came out of the wand tip. Harry grasped the wand with both hands and thought to himself, "Stop." He wanted nothing more than to conquer this. And then it happened. It listened. It stopped. No more sparks. Harry dropped the wand then, grateful that he could now separate himself from it. McGonagall looked at the wand and back at him. "What did you just do?" "I told it to stop, I guess." "Well, I thought it. I just really wanted to stop the sparks." "Potter, that's impressive. Many first years have that sort of experience without any formal training in magic. Here, let's keep trying." Harry wasn't sure that being level with a first year was much of an accomplishment. But he didn't say anything. They tried several more wands, each emitting sparks. When Harry wanted them to stop, they did. Apparently this was completely normal, and here, in anything about the wizarding world being called normal, was almost laughable. Harry was still dropping the wand once the sparks stopped, but McGonagall did not yell at him for it. In fact, the professor did not yell at all. "I think we should try the wand Ollivander specifically recommended. He has his reasons for thinking it will work, and we should trust him. If it really works for me, will it have sparks?" "Well, no. Not necessarily," McGonagall told him. "Sometimes the pillow will move across the room, or it'll explode. But the feeling will be stronger than with the other wands. You'll feel a warmth greater than the others. Somehow, you just know when it's right." He could not find anything about this, right. He took the wand she handed over to him. Why this man, Ollivander, thought this would work for him. He wasn't sure. Harry pointed the wand at a pillow and suddenly knew what McGonagall meant. There was a warmth not only in his hand, but everywhere, as though someone boosted up the temperature in the classroom. Somehow, although he never would have imagined himself feeling this, it felt natural, like the wand had been molded to fit his hand perfectly, a precise match. The pillow began to move slowly across the room and he dropped the wand, and the room returned to its normal temperature. "That's the one," McGonagall said. "But I dropped it," Harry replied. "Dropping the wand is not a contributing factor, Potter. That's just your natural reaction to seeing yourself perform magic. I have to say that we got further than I thought we would have. Here, you can put the wand in your robes." McGonagall handed him the wand, and holding it again made him wonder if it was going to do anything out of the ordinary, but it didn't. He slowly slid the wand into Hi's pocket, and when nothing weird happened, he looked back at the professor. "Will my lessons with the other teachers be like this?" Harry asked her. "Ones that require wands, yes. I'll notify them and tell them that you've acquired a wand that works for you. Classes that don't need wands will just incorporate a study session. They might have you practice with your wand if they'd like." Harry nodded. "I think our session is up, Potter," McGonagall said with finality. "I'm impressed. Don't forget that you have another tour with Miss Granger." "I won't," Harry told her. He turned to walk out of the classroom. But just as he was about to open the door and turned back around and said, "Thanks." Okay, so he was 5 minutes late, but it was better than last time. He thought that Hermione was going to point out his tardiness. But she didn't. Instead, she just said, "Hello." And she smiled. Wow, she had a pretty smile. A really, really pretty smile. "Hey," Harry replied, a little out of breath from rushing to get there. He'd been finishing up his letter to Sirius that talked all about the lesson with Snape. The parchment was rolled up in his right hand, and he knew there was only one way to get it to him, by owl. Ron had an owl, but it was kind of retarded and he didn't want the letter to fall into the wrong hands, even if he had carefully worded everything so that nobody would know the letter was to Sirius Black. But Harry remembered Sirius mentioning using the Ollery, where the school owls could be used. And hopefully they weren't as retarded as Ron's owl. Hermione, could we go to the Ollery?" Harry asked, showing her the rolled-up parchment. She took one glance at it and said, "Oh, sure. I actually have a letter to send as well." Harry assumed that her letter was to her parents. God, she was so lucky. "Mine's just, for a friend," he told her, shrugging. Hermione didn't ask who exactly this friend was or what the letter was about. She just said, "Okay." They walked in silence for a few moments, and Harry tried to memorize the route to the Ollery. Hermione folded her arms across her chest and said, "Snape is really nasty, isn't he?" There was a pause in her voice that Harry had never heard before. This wasn't Harry's favorite topic of conversation, but at least something could fill in the silence now. "He's a real prick. Ron told me that he was bad, but I didn't know he was that bad. And he kept asking me all those questions that I didn't know the answers to." Hermione didn't reply immediately. She looked deep in thought, her eyebrows knitting together in concentration. And so Harry couldn't help but ask, "What is it?" She snapped out of her trance and looked up at him, then glanced away. Her cheeks turned pink and she shook her head. "Nothing. It was stupid, really." "What?" Hermione sighed. "Well, I was just thinking that maybe I could help you and, teach you about what we're learning in potions so you'll know the answers to his questions." She didn't look at him, maybe she was afraid of his reaction, and instead took to staring at the floor as they kept walking. Harry thought it was a brilliant idea. Anything to show Snape up was perfectly fine by him. It was odd, though, to have this stranger give out this offer to him. Like it was too good to be true, and she was going to say, "Just kidding," and laugh at him for believing her. But there was no taking it back, Hermione was serious. It was probably because she hated the professor as well, with the way he'd ignored all of her silent pleads to answer his questions. She clearly was not favored by Snape. "That sounds great," Harry said. Hermione looked up at him and smiled again. "Wow, that was never going to get old. I don't have my textbook now, but I can bring it in tomorrow. If you want to start then. And obviously we don't have to spend the whole time studying. But just a brief overview on some things in order to get you started," Hermione said breathlessly. "Sounds good," Harry said. He wished he had a quill and ink to add this new plan in his letter to Sirius. They met a door out of the castle and they opened it and walked outside. The cold bit at their exposed skin, since the hour was so late and the sun was far beyond them. There was a pathway over to the Ollery, and Harry briefly wondered if they were even allowed to go out here so late. But someone like Hermione wouldn't risk breaking the rules for someone like Harry. "Oh, God, you can't even see the owls individually," Hermione complained when they walked into a darkened room. There were square spaces in the walls where the owls could escape, so a little bit of moonlight was pouring in, but it wasn't nearly enough. "Can I use a charm so we can see? It's like a flashlight." Sure," Harry said. He almost wanted to tell her about his accomplishment of acquiring his own wand, but he decided that Hermione probably didn't care, so he just kept his mouth shut. "Lumos," Hermione muttered, it sounded like Latin. Or something, and suddenly light was emitting from the tip of Hermione's wand. Harry staggered backwards a little from her, but she imitated McGonagall and acted as though that hadn't happened. Now they could see all of the owls. Harry was going to ask her which were the better ones, or if there was even a difference, but before he knew it, Hermione and her little source of light ventured off and found an owl. "Over here," Hermione beckoned, and Harry walked over to her. "It's a darker owl, so it can travel overnight without really being seen." It was as though she knew that this letter was better off not in anyone else's hands. It was kind of freaky how she knew these things. Like fucking intuition or something. "Here, I'll tie it," she offered when Harry looked dumbstruck. She took some nearby string that was by another owl and tied the parchment to the owl's ankle. "Just tell the owl who the letter needs to go to. I'll be right outside." Hermione left her lit-up wand beside Harry, by a nearby countertop, and walked out of the room. Okay, it was kind of freaking him out, how Hermione knew that this was very private and left him to tell the owl the recipient. Harry leaned towards the owl and whispered, "This letter needs to go to Sirius Black. Can you do that for me?" The owl blinked at him, and maybe that was its form of saying yes, because then it took off from the Ollery. Hermione walked back inside. She must have seen the owl fly away, and took her wand back. Her big brown eyes reflected the light of the wand as she looked up at him and said, "Now, my letter." She expertly picked out an owl and tied up the parchment to its ankle. Hermione gave it a treat from a little jar nearby and pet it softly. Maybe that was the proper way to send off a letter. By being nice to the owl. Or maybe Hermione was just one of those animal-loving people. "Send this to Mum and Dad, okay?" she said to it sweetly. The owl blinked and hooted. Hermione said, "Thank you," and it took off in the same direction as Harry's owl had. She watched it until it was completely out of sight, beyond the mountains and line of trees surrounding Hogwarts. "My parents have never really gotten used to this whole communication by owl thing," Hermione said, turning to face him and laughing softly. She had a nice laugh, too. "I was raised by Muggles," she explained. "Me, too," Harry told her. He could have already guessed from her attire that she was not from a household of witches and wizards. "Although I won't have any issues with communicating with them." "You don't get along with them?" Hermione asked innocently. She gestured for him to follow her, and they both walked out of the Ollery. She whispered, "Knox," and the light from her wand went out. He only jumped slightly at this. Again, Hermione acted perfectly normal. "That's an understatement," Harry said, laughing. But Hermione didn't laugh. Instead, she looked up at him with a concerned look on her face. "We just have some arguments, that's all," he said, backpedaling. He knew that Hermione could catch on to things quickly. And he did not want her to know just what happened in his home life. He already had the bruises and scars to prove his life of abuse. It was a secret of his that he had not even revealed to Sirius. Hermione didn't need to know about his shitty situation back home. "Oh," she said quietly. Then she cleared her throat. "Well, where to? We have the whole night ahead of us." Hermione woke up with a smile on her face. Severus Snape was just looking for trouble. And she was only too glad to provide it. Once again, Harry Potter proved himself useful without even realizing it. He could not possibly understand Hermione's loathing for Snape. But there he was, shiny and new and a perfect opportunity. A few nights ago, Hermione had offered to help Harry learn as much as he could about potions in order to stun Snape, and they were making progress as the days wore on. Once Hermione taught him enough of what Snape was bound to ask him, the professor would be in such a state of shock that maybe that smile Hermione woke up with would be permanent. But that smile could only last for so long. Discover more. Privacy policy templates. Digital art tablets. Cartoon character toys. Community forum software. Movie streaming service. Affiliate marketing programs. comic book subscriptions, author signing events tickets, writing prompts generators, video game guides. Hermione was walking back to the common room after dinner. A couple of hours was waiting to be wasted before she met up with Harry for another night together, when she heard it. Hermione. A screeching voice called out. She picked up her walking pace, desperate to make it to the common room as quickly as she could. We see you. You're right in front of us. Hermione clutched her books to her chest. Oh, come on now, don't be so rude. Her heart raced. Dread surged through her. She went numb. No, Hermione. Hermione's books fell to the floor, caused by a spell from one of the cackling girls behind her, and she fought back tears. Don't cry, Hermione. Her entire being was shaking from fear. Hermione could feel the dread weighing her down, closing her off, humiliating her. She knew this feeling all too well. She felt small and insignificant, ugly and dumb, ridiculous and embarrassed. She was defenseless. The sense of doom spread throughout her, engulfing her and shrinking her. No, no, no. Hermione didn't even have time to pick up her books, keep walking, and act like nothing happened. But by then, she realized that she could not just walk away. A confrontation was needed, and maybe she would need her wand to defend her in this case. The severity of the situation was crashing down on her. There wasn't even a spare moment for her to withdraw her wand in a last-minute attempt to defend herself. A bucket hovered above her, full of water, and before she knew it, she was drenched. The coldness of the liquid chilled her to her core, but that was nothing compared to the effect that the girl's merciless laughter had on her. There was a screaming chill running down her spine. Wait! Awe was in her eyes and she blinked quickly to get her vision back, only to see the girls. Sure enough, it was Cho Chang and her friends, surrounding her, bending over from laughter and pointing. A few tears poured out of her eyes. And she allowed them to fall, because they'd blend in with the rest of the water over her body. Her clothes were hugging every detail of her small frame that she was so desperate to hide from everyone. There was water in her shoes that weighed down her feet. Her hair was soaked down to every strand, making her look like a wet dog, surely. She was shaking harder than ever. God, the water was so cold. Her teeth chattered loudly against the noise of the cackling girls. Hermione instinctively rubbed her arms in order to provide herself with warmth, but it was no use. This chill was not something that any sort of heat could cure. It was an internal chill that wrapped its cruel fingers around her heart and squeezed hard. Please make it stop. Look at her. The girls called after her as Hermione stood there, defenseless and weak and ugly. Then they slowly faded away, walked beyond other corridors, probably looking for more victims. They left her alone. All alone. Soon enough, their laughter died out. It was far beyond her shrinking self, and there was silence enclosing Hermione. It was that still silence that was sure to have more threats waiting in the wings. Hermione was expecting them to return, or for even worse people to show up and taunt her some more. It was unsettling. Hermione wanted nothing more than to run away and never spend another day at this cursed school. She needed to hide, needed to stay shut away forever and not see a single soul for years. How had she even smiled that day? How had Hermione ever been happy? It was a foreign emotion to her. A complete stranger. Something she'd never really known. Her heart sunk. Something got caught in her throat as she suppressed sobs. It was moments like these that made her feel ugly, useless, a waste of space. She reached into her robes and cast a drying spell on herself and her books, and it was almost like she was good as new. Almost. That chill was still there, terrorizing her with the memory of what had just happened. Hermione bent down and picked up her books. Tears were still falling, this time not concealed by the water of a bucket from hell. And she couldn't help it, she let out small sobs. Just little by little, sobs materialized out from behind her chattering teeth. Hermione couldn't even imagine how horrible she looked at that moment, but then again, she always looked horrible. Her books were in front of her as a useless shield that could not protect her. Nothing could protect her. Nobody was going to save her from this misery. This wasn't one of those novels T. had her mother read in her spare time. No savior was going to come out of nowhere and save her from her troubles and call her beautiful and whisk her away to a utopian place with absolute perfection and no hate. This was the harsh reality of life, and it did not save anyone from its grasp. Hermione sat in a corner of the common room that was covered by enough shadows that nobody could see her. She desperately wished she had an invisibility cloak, or something of the sort, to keep her concealed from the world forever. There were other students there after a while, and their chatter was laced with words like Hermione Granger, and bucket, and Cho Chang. Of course, it was the most hilarious thing that had happened that day. Just too funny. Word was spreading around fast, and the hideous CENTER of all of this attention was hiding in the shadows. She was already late to her tour with Harry, but he was probably late also. Who even cared about the stupid tours? Who even cared about anything? At one point, everyone had left to return to the dormitories due to the late hour, and a window of opportunity was shouting at Hermione. Hermione stood up, angry and depressed, and ugly. She wiped tears from her face and made an attempt to compose herself before exiting through the portrait hole. She was alone because she was falling apart, and she was falling apart because she was alone. Corridors were filled to the brim with a chilling silence. She knew that she looked ugly already, but she probably looked even worse than usual due to what had happened. She did not want to even imagine what her appearance must have been. Hermione felt mortified in her own skin. But within a few minutes, she approached their usual meeting place only to find that Harry was already there. The normalcy of it all made her want to cry. His hands were in his pockets and he gave her a small smile. Hermione had never seen him really smile before. He seemed incapable of feelings like that. "Hi," he said. "Hello," Hermione choked out. She crossed her arms over her chest and stared at the floor. She needed to look at anything but Harry. Maybe Harry already knew what happened. Well, of course he knew. He was Harry Potter, for Merlin's sake. And he was going to be fed gossip the most out of anyone in this bloody school. "Oh, no, I forgot the potions textbook," Hermione said, smacking her forehead. She'd been so caught up in the day's events that she had forgotten to go back to her dormitory to get her book. But even if she did remember, she might have been too afraid to return there. Many of girls in Gryffindor sided with Cho Chang. "That's fine," Harry shrugged. Hermione had thought he was going to get angry, but he was completely calm about it all. "Maybe it's better off to take a break, you know. Give my brain a rest from all of that potions bollocks." He looked at her like he was expecting her to chuckle or something, but she didn't, and so he sighed and awkwardly continued with, "Should we start walking, then?" Yeah, I suppose," Hermione said in a near whisper. As they started to walk, she rubbed her arms for warmth, but it was no use. Harry turned to her like he was going to say something. But he did not ask her if she was okay, or wonder what was wrong. Why would he? Why would anyone care? Instead, he just said, "I've been having some extra help lessons," to break the tense silence. "With Professor McGonagall." "Yeah, I have a working wand now." Hermione looked over at him, surprised. Her eyes widened. "Oh, wow. That's an improvement, I guess. Congratulations." Harry smiled. "Thanks. I mean, I haven't, performed any spells, really." Hermione almost offered to help him with getting started with performing magic, but that might have put her in danger. She didn't know his reaction to seeing magic, and as was recommended by McGonagall, she did not want to see it. And besides, she was useless, anyways. Her attempts were very likely to fail. "I'm sure you'll be able to someday. Hey, you haven't told anyone about me being, weird, around magic, have you?" Hermione could almost laugh at this. Who would I tell, Harry? His eyebrows furrowed together in concentration. The fact that he had to think hard about who she'd tell anything to made her shrink even more, feeling dumber and uglier by the second. "Your friend, Neville," Hermione corrected. "Right, Neville. But you didn't tell him, right?" "Of course not," she said sharply, practically snapping at him. She was almost offended that he'd think she'd go and tell someone about something like that. Hermione returned to looking back at the floor, cowering. Good. There was another silence between them, and Hermione showed him where the astronomy tower was. That was one of the sections that they had not covered yet on their towers. The chilliness bit at them when they went outside, but the sight was all worth it. The stars were plentiful that night, sparkling against the blackened sky. A few owls that she could barely make out were soaring through the air, most likely carrying mail to recipients. Or maybe some were just hunting. "It's beautiful out," Hermione couldn't help but say when they reached the balcony. Then she kind of felt stupid because, well, it was obvious just how beautiful it was. Harry did not need to be told that. Seeing the perfection of the landscape made her want to cry. Someone like her, someone so ugly, did not even deserve to look at such beauty. It wasn't fair. Nothing was fair. It is, he agreed. Hermione saw Harry looking at her through the corner of her eye and she turned to face him. It was uncomfortable, being looked at like that. What? He shook his head and shrugged. Nothing. Oh. Well, I didn't mean, like, it's just that, Your hair looks nice like that, Harry muttered. Hermione looked down at her hair, it was getting so annoying and long, and it was just like it always was, down, and in a mess. Thanks, she said quietly. She was sure that he meant it as a recovery from looking at her, of course, he didn't actually mean it. Hermione wasn't stupid. She knew what she looked like, especially what her hair looked like. And it never looked nice like that. Maybe he was even being sarcastic. There was a pause and then Harry said, "You know, I never really did this kind of stuff. When I lived with the Dursleys, my aunt and uncle, I mean. I guess I just didn't appreciate it." Hermione leaned onto the balcony and stared up at the moon. It was nearly a full moon, so its luminosity was shining down on them. Blessing them. "I've spent a lot of time looking outside at night," she admitted. She could feel tears stinging her eyes. "I guess I just had so much time, you know. It gets lonely, but the moon. And the stars, they're still there every night. It's like something I can rely on, no matter what." Harry looked at her the same way he had before. Wow. Hermione kind of felt stupid for saying that in the first place. No, it's interesting to see your way of thinking, that's all. Hermione hesitated before asked, Is that a bad thing? Probably. No. I've just never really met anyone like you, I guess, is what I'm saying. Hermione supposed she should have taken that as a compliment. Most girls would swoon over hearing Harry Potter saying something like that, but for some reason, her brain could not fathom compliments. She couldn't help but think that he was being sarcastic, or secretly mean, or something along those cruel lines. Okay, she said softly. A few minutes passed and they just stood there in silence, looking out at the beautiful view from the tower. If Harry knew anything about the incident with Cho Chang, he did not show it. Surely, if he knew, he'd tell her. Right. Maybe he wouldn't have even shown up if he knew just how badly Hermione was victimized here. He might have cancelled these tours altogether, because really, Ho wanted to spend time with Hermione Granger. He'd probably cancel them tomorrow, because he'd certainly find out by then, if he didn't already know. But how could he not know? It seemed that everyone in the Gryffindor house, at least, knew what had happened, because the chatter had been never-ending. Surely he knew, but why wasn't he acting like it? What was wrong with him? Harry turned and his green eyes fell on her. God. His eyes were really green. It was unlike any other eye color she'd seen before. Let's head back inside. Why? But Harry didn't say anything at first, he started walking back. And Hermione was following him for some reason. And then he turned and shrugged. You looked cold. Harry knew exactly what had happened between Hermione and Cho Chang. Why did you want to meet here? Harry had asked him when he caught up with Ron in the library a couple of hours before. Mate, I just had to get confirmation on what just happened. What do you mean? And then Ron proceeded to tell Harry the story in which a girl named Cho Chang dumped a bucket of water onto Hermione Granger. She's really hot, Ron had said about Cho when Harry asked who the hell Cho freaking Chang was. Like, smoking hot. And get this, she's single. She broke up with Cedric Diggory over the summer. I'm thinking about going in for the kill. And then Ron rambled some more, and all Harry could think about was Hermione and the way she smiled and the way that girl Cho Chang had ripped that smile right from her face. The worst part was that Harry had been the one pouring buckets of water onto people back in his Muggle school. He'd been the one antagonizing the weak. So now, as he stood next to Hermione, who was still shivering, he knew that the least he could do was to not bring up the incident, to act like it never happened. Harry didn't know what it was like to be teased, as he had usually been the one doing the teasing, but he could imagine that Hermione wouldn't want to talk about it. So he would do just that, not talk about it. He wasn't going to freaking cuddle her, or sing her to sleep, or anything like that, but he could at least not mention it and act as though it was another normal day. And Hermione seemed to be trying to act like it didn't happen, either. He had to give the girl credit, she did compose herself pretty well. Although she was a little quieter and she'd been cowering away more than usual. It wasn't enough to be considered completely out of the ordinary. She'd be fine, wouldn't she? I'm not that cold, Hermione replied with dignity. It was kind of cute. You're shivering. Hermione looked down and saw her own trembling body. She was wearing muggle clothes, as she always did on these nightly tours. Maybe she felt comfortable because she knew that Harry was raised by muggles. As well. She shrugged, defeated. Well, okay, I guess I'm a little cold. Harry wondered why anyone would tease Hermione, she wasn't ugly. Did anyone here see that? Did nobody else see those big brown eyes? Or those freckles across her nose, or that smile? He knew that the bullying was most likely more towards how smart she was. She really was incredibly smart. It was almost scary, and the fact that her only real friend was Nevio. Or Neville. Whoever that boy was. What time is it? Hermione asked quietly. Her voice was so soft that he had to strain to hear her. Who cares? Hermione shrugged. True. Harry paused. How long have you been staying up? He asked. The dark circles under her eyes were far worse than his own. She must have been keeping this unbreakable habit for a while. Too long, she replied. She rubbed her eyes. I started around when I turned 12, and I'm turning 16 in a couple of weeks. Then Hermione stopped looking at the floor and turned to face him. Those dark circles looking even darker than before. 4 years, how could she even still function? Just before this school year started. I'm a rookie, you know, he said jokingly. She didn't smile. What happened? She asked gently. Her eyes squinted as her gaze searched his face, looking for answers. Of course she'd draw the right conclusions, that's something traumatic must have happened for him to start staying up at night. No matter how bad Hermione's day was, she still showed concern for him. It made him feel like a horrible person. A lot happened, Harry said. Well, I know that you didn't run away, she told him confidently. The Daily Prophet is rubbish. In that moment, Harry was almost willing to tell Hermione about Voldemort, about Sirius, about every single thing that had been worrying him. He knew that she wouldn't breathe a word of it. But after 4 years of staying awake herself, she clearly had her own problems to deal with. 4 years. Just as long as she'd been at Hogwarts. Oh God. ... Late night? Ron asked. Harry shrugged. That was his response every time someone asked him about his sleeping habits. Only Hermione really knew just how little sleep he got. It must have been something about nighttime and its loneliness that made Harry and Hermione freely talk about stuff like that. Ron winked at him, and Harry said, "You're disgusting." Because it wasn't anything like that. Oh, come on, you know I'm joking, Ron said. Unless, you've already. No, I haven't been with any girls here yet, Harry told him. Although, really, he was not oblivious to the stares he got from various girls at school. Girls loved bad boys. Harry still could not wrap his head around that philosophy, but it sure as hell worked. Maybe it was about time to find someone to hook up with. Many of the girls at this school seemed willing. Whoa, look out, to your left, Ron hastily whispered in his ear. It was spoken in that "oh God there's a hot girl in our presence" voice. Even wizards could pull that off. Harry was impressed. Harry snapped his head to the left, and sure enough, oh God there was a hot girl in their presence. She was about as pretty as Hermione. But she certainly walked with more confidence and was one of those willing girls. Hey, Harry, she said with a smile as she walked past. And before Harry could even have time to process what was going on, she walked away. Just like that. He knew that stunt that girls pulled very well. That's Cho Chang, the girl I was telling you about, who poured a bucket of water on Granger, Ron said, flustered. The girl then turned and smiled at Harry once more. He didn't smile back. That's it for today, I will stop here. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you please see Onsider, subscribe and make sure to hit that like button, share with your friends, and don't forget to check out author of this story. Details in description.